Kids, welcome to the Far Out Podcast. The time has come. Execute episode 66. Because we're going to talk about Star Wars. Specifically, a Star Wars movie that turns 10 years old this year in the big 2026. And I am talking about Rogue One, a Star Wars story. And yes, kids, Rogue One is now 10 years old. Isn't that just a odd thing to think about? I mean this sincerely. I was there, kids. Kids in my day, I remember when Disney got Star Wars, Lucasfilm did press releases, the changing of the guard, the reestablishment of canon. I remember when stuff got added, stuff got subtracted, so on and so forth. And of course, the big centerpiece was the fact that Disney wanted to make multiple Star Wars movies. Of course, there was the sequel trilogy. So with that announcement, we were confirmed to get at least 3 movies. But they wanted to go beyond that. They were going to tell many Star Wars stories. So in between each sequel trilogy film, so after episode 7, in that gap year, we would get another movie. Then we get episode 8. Then we get another movie. Then we'd get episode 9. Essentially, the plan was to release a Star Wars movie every year for 5 years. And that's what Disney did. If you really think about it, we had episode 7 in 2015, Rogue One in 16, episode 8 and 17, Solo in 8. No, I'm getting this mixed up. 7 and 15, Rogue One 16, episode 8 in 17, Solo in 18, and episode 9 and 19. There, boy, that's kind of a tongue twister there, just as I said it out loud. But Disney wanted to do a movie for every year for the next 5 years, and they did just that. We got many great Star Wars stories out of it. Well, one of them in particular was Rogue One, and this was the first anthology Star Wars movie to be released under the new Disney ideology, because of course with the previous Star Wars movies we've just had the episodic films 1 through 6. Well, now Disney had the idea that they were just going to be able to tell other stories, which I thought was a great idea. The idea now that we can go beyond the Skywalker family, we can tell other pockets within the Star Wars galaxy, I thought was a really, really cool idea. And one of the ideas that was presented really early on was what Rogue One ended up becoming, is that Disney wanted to tell a story about the stealing of the Death Star plans, the plans that we are shown in Episode 4, A New Hope. And then in the opening crawl of Episode 4, it talks about how a group of rebels have stolen the plans to the Death Star. And so Disney wanted to take quite literally that one line of text, not even dialogue, not a scene in the movie. They wanted to take a descriptive line from the opening crawl of A New Hope, and they wanted to expand that into a feature film. And I'm being totally sincere. I mean this 100% in honesty, with genuine nature. I thought that idea was great. Before a single frame of Rogue One was shot, I thought, what a brilliant idea. Brilliant. Like, that is something that maybe us fans have thought about, like, ooh, how do you think they actually did it? How complicated do you think that was? What were the losses? Surely that was an insurmountable, task that they had to accomplish. How did the rebels, who are, this plucky band of, freedom fighters, how did they take on the Empire before we see them take on the Death Star? How did they get the plans to the Death Star? Well, Rogue One explores that. And I've seen the film multiple times. I saw it either 4 or 5 times in its original run in 2016 into 2017 because it came out in December. And I have now rewatched the film in the lead up to the recording of this episode. And I'll say this. Having not seen the film now in its entirety for several years, I will confidently say this. Rogue One is incredible. It's a great Star Wars movie, and even beyond that, it's just a great movie. I forgot how good Rogue One is. It's incredibly entertaining. The dialogue is snappy. The action is full throttle. The characters are cool. The locations are unique. The story is enthralling. It has everything a good movie needs to be a piece of worthy entertainment. Beyond that, it has everything it needs to be a worthy piece of Star Wars storytelling, which, you know, not to bring, bring one thing down to raise one thing up, but like if you just look at the totality of Disney's tenure with Star Wars and with the Lucasfilm banner, not everything they've released has been up to snuff, in my opinion. Most notably, people have many pitfalls with the sequel trilogy, that being the big cornerstone of what they wanted to do. I'm in that camp as well. I think The Force Awakens is great. I think The Last Jedi is complicated, and I think that Rise of Skywalker Episode 9 is pretty messy. There are redeeming qualities in all of those things, but the sequel trilogy is not held in the same regard that the original trilogy is or that the prequel trilogy is. Rogue One, however, despite it not being a episodic feature in the timeline, I think it exists seamlessly with the quality that Star Wars has set with its previous entries, again, being the original trilogy, being the prequel trilogy, and Rogue One, funny enough, is a perfect companion piece to the prequel era Star Wars filmmaking and the original trilogy Star Wars filmmaking. There are so many great elements woven throughout this movie that perfectly capture what it means to be in the Star Wars universe. When I was watching this movie, I didn't realize how much of a buffet this movie was for Star Wars fans. There's callbacks to the prequels. There's callbacks to the original trilogy. There's the blending of animation as well, because there are characters that have existed in the Clone Wars animated series and in the Rebels animated series that get a live action treatment. It is further cementing that despite Star Wars existing in books, comics, video games, movies, TV shows, and so on, that this whole universe is one big universe. And Rogue One does this to perfection. I think this movie is the bee's knees. I think it has aged like fine wine, and getting to revisit it again for this podcast was an absolute delight. It took me back to the theater. I felt all the emotions, everything hit. I even, I got a little misty-eyed at some points. I really did. There are some points to where like just seeing the grandeur that is Star Wars on screen, I was just like, my gosh, I was like, this is it. I feel like I'm a kid discovering this. And for kids that did get to discover Star Wars through this, or got their fandom expanded through Rogue One, I mean, that is what it's all about. And so, yeah, Rogue One is a really, really great film, and I'm so happy to have revisited it. But yeah, now let's move beyond the grand scale, or let's move beyond the large-scale overview that I'm presenting of Rogue One. Let's actually get into the film itself. This will be a somewhat of a shot-by-shot analysis, not frame by frame, but I'm going to take my time with this. I'm going to highlight many, many pieces that I think work really well from this movie. I want this to be a kind of commentary and analysis on the movie. I don't want this to just be a 10-minute segment of me gushing about the movie. I want this to be a real in-depth look at the movie itself. And so there are many pieces I'm going to want to highlight here. And so I'm going to, present a lot of context for these things. And I'm just going to do a real in-depth, deep dive on the movie. And yeah, without further ado, let's get down to business and watch Rogue One, a Star Wars story. All right, kids. So now we are in Rogue One, and I've got the movie queued up here on the Disney Plus, and so I'm gonna do, kind of I'm gonna start and stop it and talk about things that come up in the movie. And one of the things that I think captured a lot of fans by surprise, most notably, was the lack of an opening crawl with Star Wars. Because if you watch any of the episodic movies, 1 through 6, you'll know that we get the classic Star Wars opening crawl, the fanfare, and then we get that great yellow text floating through space that talks about, the plans to the Death Star have been stolen and they've been transmitted to Princess Leia and she's on the run. And then we get into our movie. That's how every Star Wars movie has started prior to Rogue One. Well, Rogue One set a new trend, for better or worse, in my opinion, worse, of not having the crawl. Disney had a mandate that the opening crawl was going to be just for episodic Star Wars releases to make them more special. I think that's a mistake. I think that there are certain hallmarks of the Star Wars franchise that belong to just Star Wars movies, not a certain kind of Star Wars movies. So to not have an opening crawl, I think, in my opinion, is a bit jarring, including for myself. When I saw this movie in 2016, I remember how sudden that felt. How you don't realize what a good thing you have until it's gone. And I missed it. I really did miss it when Rogue One started. I'm not saying that the movie gets off to a bad start, by no means. I'm actually going to say the inverse here in just a couple of seconds. But again, from the jump, we get the sense we're in different territory now. We're in uncharted waters a little bit with Rogue One, but it's going to equal for some pretty good payoff here. I do like that at the start we get, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. I really appreciate that opening sense to the movie as well. That does present the story in a similar fashion to other Star Wars tales. The idea that Star Wars is told from a fairy tale type of perspective, where a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. The idea that this is history that we are viewing, I think, is really, really cool as well. But despite us losing the opening crawl, the opening shot in particular, the very first couple of frames of Rogue One, I think is really, really cool. We get a cool music sting to open things up, and we get a nice shot of a planet here. Then the camera pans up, which is what Star Wars does as well. There's this motif that the movie will open in space and either pan up or pan down to a planet. So Rogue One pays homage to that by panning up. What's interesting, though, is that we get a cool shot here of what we find out are rings to a planet, but the abruptness of which the rings stop in space is a really interesting visual, because we think of rings as being circular, but from our perspective we're looking at them from this kind of different position, so it looks like they've just been cut off with a knife. They look like there's this hard defining wall that exists in space and the rings just smash into. I also like that the perspective at which we're looking at the rings, there's a point in the center of the screen there that almost resembles the point of a Star Destroyer, again from the opening of A New Hope. You have the gray body of the Star Destroyer fading into view in A New Hope. You have the gray point of the rings of this planet, also again resembling that classic triangular shape. So while Rogue One is not following Star Wars beats to the letter, they are really aiming on target, in my opinion, and they're hitting a lot of the right notes, and I really like the way the movie begins. All right, kids, so now I've jumped ahead about a minute and a half, so about 90 seconds worth here, and we're getting an introduction to some of the characters we're going to follow, one of them being Galen Erso, played by Mads Mikkelsen, and I think he's a really tremendous actor, and I think he did a really good job in the role. For myself, though, there's some fun behind-the-scenes stuff regarding Galen Erso, regarding his character. When Disney bought Star Wars, they went through with an axe, and they cut out a lot of stuff from the Star Wars universe. They wanted to decanonize some things to give them more breathing space for stories they wanted to tell. Perfect example, in some comic books and novels, there were stories that featured Luke Skywalker training a new generation of Jedi. There were also stories that featured Princess Leia and Han Solo having children together. Well, when Disney bought Star Wars, they said, we want to tell those stories, most notably in film format, but we don't want to be held by what came in a comic book or book, back in the 80s, 90s, and so on. And so Disney went through, right and wrongly, in my opinion, and cut out a lot of stories, so that way they could tell their own versions of Luke's generation of Jedi and, Han Solo and Princess Leia's children, so on and so forth. Well, nothing was safe. There were books, comic books, and video games that were cut from canon as well. For myself, a video game series that I grew up playing from the Star Wars universe was called The Force Unleashed, in that you played as Darth Vader's secret apprentice, going out and killing enemies of the Empire, so on and so forth. A lot of fun, very bombastic, great action, made for a perfect video game. I have a very, very fond memory of playing those games because I was the perfect age when those came out. I was like, 10, 11, 12 years old. It was just spectacular. Well, in the game The Force Unleashed, you played as the protagonist known as Starkiller. That was your code name as Darth Vader's secret apprentice. His actual human name, I believe, was Galen. It wasn't Galen Erso. I think it was Galen Malik, maybe? Galen Marak. I should know this because I love The Force Unleashed so much. But I know for a fact that the character's name, his first name was Galen, and his code name was Starkiller. Just as how Darth Vader is Anakin Skywalker, Starkiller is Galen. Well, what's interesting is that Disney went through and decanonized those video games, saying they're just legends, they're considered fiction to the Star Wars universe. Those stories did not happen. What's funny, though, is that in 2015's The Force Awakens, Episode 7, the base upon which the First Order is residing is called Starkiller Base. So Disney essentially repurposed the name Starkiller, took it from an individual character, put it onto a base. Could be an interesting callback to The Force Unleashed. I myself personally think so. I think that they absolutely gave a wink and a nod to the Force Unleashed series by reusing the name. Well, they do the same thing here with Rogue One just 1 year later. They reused the first name of the character, Galen. So I find that interesting. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. In fact, I'm saying it's a good thing. I like the fact that someone at Lucasfilm was winking and nodding to us Force Unleashed fans like myself, and said, hey, we're not going to use those characters and those stories from The Force Unleashed, but we're going to use even something as simple as a title. And so the name Galen came from The Force Unleashed. That was the name of Darth Vader's secret apprentice. That was his biological name. Gets repurposed into Galen Erso in Rogue One, and the code name under which you operate as the secret apprentice to Darth Vader is Starkiller, and that name got repurposed into Starkiller Base in The Force Awakens. So again, I really like those things. In a world where I can't have The Force Unleashed proper exist in the Star Wars universe, I like the sense that there are still callbacks. I think it was Dave Filoni, who is now the head of Lucasfilm, when he was still working on Clone Wars and Rebels, the TV series, he was giving a behind-the-scenes interview, and he's like, at Lucasfilm, we never throw anything away. Nothing. We don't ever throw anything away. Old concept art pieces from movies, ideas that someone writes on a napkin, we save all this stuff because it all can be reused at some point. So there are old ship designs that were maybe not utilized for the original trilogy. They're going to get used in the prequel trilogy. Same could be said for the prequel trilogy. Stuff that they designed for Episode 3 might get repurposed into something later, so on and so forth. And so I like the fact that even though something was quote-unquote decanonized from Star Wars, that it still exists, even in a shoebox somewhere in the halls of Lucasfilm, probably in some vault somewhere. So yeah, just two fun instances of a callback to a fun video game series, The Force Unleashed, in The Force Awakens and in Rogue One, respectively. I also think too that part of the attire that Galen Erso wears, not here in this shot of the movie, but a little later in the movie, part of the attire that he wears when he's formerly working with the Empire, even his clothing resembles a bit of what Starkiller wore in the video game. So again, they're winking and nodding to The Force Unleashed, and I really, really appreciate that. The ship in question, the shuttle that Director Krennic arrived to this planet on to interrogate Galen's family. I really like the ship design because it kind of resembles, well, frankly, it resembles a bunch of different versions of a shuttlecraft that we'll see in Star Wars media. It, of course, resembles the Imperial design, the kind of white, gray kind of Imperial shuttle that the Emperor likes to fly around in. It also kind of resembles something that we'll see future Inquisitor characters utilize as well later in Star Wars media. I even think it has a little bit of flavor of Kylo Ren's shuttle from the sequel trilogy as well. And so again, I like that there's this sense of uniformity throughout all the eras of Star Wars, despite on the timeline there being literal decades of storytelling. The shuttles, while not being exact models, it's not like they're using the Emperor shuttle, for all, different iterations. Each version that we see, though, does kind of share similarities. Again, the kind of angular body with the long wings, even the way the engines look on the back, kind of have a Republic era shuttle appearance to them, and so I really appreciate that. Even just from the ship landing, before we even get to see the villain get introduced, I like the fact that he's just arriving in style with his cool shuttle here. Here we go. Here's a really cool shot here. Director Krennic being flanked by his Death Troopers. I love the look of the Death Troopers. Again, Star Wars has stormtroopers act as pure cannon fodder. There's a million of them. They can't aim. They all look the same. Yada yada. They're the perfect enemy to take out because again, they're so numerous. You can just have however many you want. Continue to come at towards our heroes and whatnot. With the Death Troopers, though, what a cool, unique design. The black armor, the unique armor pieces, even their blasters look different from the standard Stormtrooper. And they're much taller as well. I think that in official canon, they might have been surgically augmented and maybe have some machine bits in them. Maybe give them a taller, frame to make them look bigger. And of course, their voice is so cool as well. They don't talk in clear English. They talk in a garbled radio static that only they can perceive because they're such an elite unit that no one else is privy to their communications. Only their communications need to be shared between other squad members here, so they're deeply encrypted. I love the look of the Death Troopers. I love their appearance. I love the way they present themselves on screen. I think they were a really really cool design and a cool addition to the Star Wars universe. I haven't commented on this yet, even though we've seen a helping or a hearty helping of it, even just a few minutes into the movie. But the vista shots, the landscape shots of Rogue One are exquisite. And this shot here of just Galen Erso standing by what appears to be some kind of radio antenna, looking on as Orson Krennic, approaches him. Rogue One is a beautiful movie. It has some incredible cinematography and some of the locations they used to shoot. I really like as well. And so on the approach of this planet, you get to see the mountains and the ocean, and just the black dirt, almost that resembles like soot, and then you have the dark green grass and the ominous gray sky here with just the smallest bit of white on the horizon with Director Krennic approaching. And again, we see even now these dark spots here are his Death Troopers, and I love the shot of the shuttle in the background there. Even just something like this, the framing of this shot here, I think, is so cool. And again, it's really a testament to the filmmakers, even just like getting good scouts to find these locations. I think that Rogue One even excels in something as quote unquote small like locations. I love the fact that not all of this was shot on a soundstage. There are a lot of real locations in Rogue One, and I just think it's awesome. I like this shot here too of as Jin escapes with her mother. Of course, she's going to leave her to go back and try to save her husband. But before she does that, she gives Jin a necklace made of a kyber crystal, and kyber crystals are what charge the lightsaber. They're actually the crystal that emits the blade that we see lightsabers use. So, a blue crystal gives a blue blade, red for a red blade, so on and so forth. Well, this one's clear, meaning it hasn't been touched by either the light side or the dark side of the force. And so she herself, somehow has a kyber crystal, and we, come to know that the Death Star is powered by kyber crystals, hence why it's able to generate such high amounts of energy. So I like to think that during the not destruction, during the building, the construction of the Death Star, again led by Galen Erso, that he might have just given his wife a little kyber crystal mineral fragment, just so as a nice token, and now that's being passed along to Jin here. But I also like the fact too that Jin's mother before she departs, she says, "Trust the Force." And again, this appeals to the faith nature that is prevalent in Star Wars. Because George Lucas, when he was creating Star Wars, he of course um, appealed to samurai movies, Kurosawa, spaghetti westerns, and so on and so forth. Well, part of this as well also has to do with an appeal to God, and I don't know of Lucas's faith and whatnot, but the Force does resemble the sense of a higher power, and so I liked the sense that we see characters here who are not particularly Jedi, who are not particularly Sith. We think of the Force as just being another tool for them to use. Well, for the rest of the galaxy, the Force is a binding nature. You can either choose to believe it or choose to not believe it. And then there are some characters who have the ability to manipulate it, like the Jedi, like the Sith. But for Jyn Erso's mother here, she she has some acknowledgement of it. She has this sense of hope, or even desperate naivete, that as she has to leave her daughter to try to save her, to trust in the Force and to give her a kyber crystal. It's appealing to the powerful nature of the Force, and I think that that's cool to see. Kind of a wink and a nod to the idea of faith represented in Star Wars, and we of course see that later throughout other characters of the movie, who have a much you know heavily they have a much higher reliance on the Force, and they rely on it heavily to do certain things and to lead them forward in life. But yeah, this instance right here of again the necklace and Jin's mother's parting words, I think it's really really cool moment in the movie. I love the look here of Director Krennic, played by Ben Mendelsohn. He plays such a good Imperial. The tone of voice, the mannerisms, the lines on his face, and the costume as well. The white, pristine nature to, his uniform, accented by his dark cap and the cape, and even just the red identification bar on his chest here signifying his rank. I love the look of his character, and the Empire just in particular. Such cool designs. They really stand out and represent their evil ways and intentions now. Even just in the presentation that he's giving now, he still gives off this threatening sense to him, and I think it's a really really cool character design played by a really really good actor. As I said earlier too, the dialogue in Rogue One is incredible. This movie is so well written. I love the lines here that Krennic shares to Galen. Talking about the destruction, excuse me, the construction of the Death Star. They're alluding to that. We were this close to greatness, this close to providing peace and security for the galaxy. And Galen says, you're confusing peace, with terror. And Krennic retorts back, well, you have to start somewhere. I just love that. Love that for the Empire, you know, there is no difference. All they know is strength. Hence why they have, fleets of Star Destroyers. Hence why they have Death Troopers. Hence why they want a Death Star. I love that. And that line of dialogue there, confusing peace with terror. And you have to start somewhere. I think that's some good stuff right there. That is some good meaty dialogue. And you have Director Krennic, of course. He's trying to bait Galen back into the program. And Galen is saying, I can't. I've given it up. Farming is what I know now. My mind, it hasn't been what it once was, especially since my wife Lyra died. And of course Krennic gives false sincerity, saying, my condolences. Then of course we see uh, Galen's wife Lyra come running up to try to save him, and even just the tone of voice that Matt Mickelson has here with Director Krennic, just saying, oh look, here comes Lyra, back from the dead. Oh, it's a miracle, and we know as fans, as viewers of this stuff, that he is going to utilize, or he wants to utilize Galen's family as leverage, talking about how he's going to take them. Lyra's like, you're not gonna take my husband. He won't come work for you, and Orson Krennic says, "Of course, I'm not taking just him. I'm taking all of you." And so the idea that they're going to be, kept in quote unquote comfort, like they're going to be hostages, and they're going to be utilized as leverage to keep Galen on task, to keep him at the facilities, to keep them working. It's not just enough for them to capture him, because he can act as he pleases just as an individual. But if there's the constant thumb of the Empire, pressed against his family, if they're constantly threatening his family, that's going to motivate Galen to work here. And so again, Mads Mikkelsen, what a good actor as Krennic. Even just in those little bits of dialogue, he is presenting himself as just a great villain. This shot here of Forrest Whitaker's character looking down the bunker access, door to secure Jin. This is and was a big deal for Star Wars fans like myself who are really deep in the lore, because Saw Gerrera is a character that existed in the Clone Wars first, the animated series, prior to him being brought into live action. So he was the first character who created the bridge, further cementing that animation, live action, whatever, it's all one Star Wars universe. He was brought from the Clone Wars TV show, the animated TV show, into live action. Love that. I love the fact that there's no adult table and kids table in terms of Star Wars. Look, is a Star Wars book going to be held in the same regard as the movies? No, of course not. Yes, they're still Star Wars stories, but they're told in entirely different mediums. Well, the TV shows are very close. They are the younger siblings to the movies, but with the Clone Wars, that wasn't live action, that was animation. And so for me, it's all one big great thing. But for the casual fan, yeah, there is going to be some distinction. Some fans only want to watch live action stuff. Some fans only want to watch live action movies. They don't care about anything else. Which is fine. But I think that if you're doing that, you're robbing yourself of so many great stories and all this connective tissue. Well, Rogue One builds bridges here. It takes a character introduced in an animated TV show, The Clone Wars, brings it into live action. And so to see a Clone Wars character utilized and realized in live action, freaking great. On top of that, too, the storytelling implications for this, it establishes that Saw Gerrera survived the Clone Wars, and you can watch his episodes in the Clone Wars TV show. He fought with the Republic against the droid army of the Separatists, so he fought with the clone troopers. And now in Rogue One, he is battling against the Empire and their stormtroopers. And so, again, for him to be realized in live action is great, and for him to be realized by such a great actor as Forrest Whitaker, I think is just really, really awesome. The next shot here, the title card, again, kind of pulls back or harkens back to what I was talking about earlier in this recording, where Rogue One doesn't have an opening crawl, but it does have the blue text that says, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Well, Rogue One kind of sort of, wants to have the cake and eat it too, because it doesn't have the big yellow Star Wars font with the fanfare, that announces the movie is starting, which would come, prior to the crawl. Instead, it has its own title, Rogue One, in a Star Wars-ish font, and in that big yellow font, again, blasting through space and whatnot. But it's not the same. It's not, it's just not the same. Again, not saying it's a bad thing, but it's like, hey, do you want, a Pepsi? Oh, we only have Coke. Oh, okay, and it's Diet Coke. Like, okay, fine, sure. It's one of those things. So again, like I like that it's here, because I'm not sure how else you would do it. But if you want the yellow Star Wars text, just have the yellow Star Wars text. Like, you don't, it's not like It's not like there are guardrails on this thing, again, unless Disney put guardrails on this stuff and whatnot. So yeah, the title card for Rogue One in this yellow presentation here, good, not great. I get what they were going for, but in my opinion, it kind of missed the mark of having the original big yellow splash page that features the Star Wars main title, opening crawl, all that stuff. We then cut back to Jyn Erso, now an adult. We last saw her escaping with Saw Gerrera as a child, but now she's a fully grown adult, and she's in an Imperial prison, and she's played by Felicity Jones. And in the same way I talked about, Mads Mikkelsen, and Ben Mendelsohn, giving such strength to their respective characters with their acting abilities. The same is 100% for Felicity Jones and Jyn Erso. Loved the character of Jyn Erso. Really enjoyed Felicity Jones as the character. I think she looks great in the movie in pretty much every outfit. I think she does have kind of that Princess Leia, that Padme Amidala appeal to where whatever she's wearing for the situation, in the movie, I think that she looks great. And even just, seeing her inside the prison here, of course it's dirty and it's grimy, and she looks, tough. She's got an edge to her, but also I'll just call it outright. Felicity Jones is a beautiful woman, and I think that she looks great, and I think she carries herself really well. I think that she stands alongside such heavy hitters like a Princess Leia, like a Padme Amidala. And yeah, I think that Felicity Jones brought a lot to the character of Jyn Erso, and I love her introduction in this Imperial prison. And then the next location we're introduced to is the Ring of Catherine, which is this trading outpost. And I just love just the introduction, the establishing shot of the location. I love the fact that it's a city built between two asteroids. What a cool and unique and precarious location to have for your movie. And for us, it looks small, but then once we get down into the city streets, we see that it's quite vast, and that it houses many different kinds of people. Giving us that sense of tone of the cantina, the bar from A New Hope, but also the city streets of Coruscant from the prequel trilogy as well. Just what a cool shot, though. I mean, the idea to build a civilization in between two asteroids, something that shouldn't be hospitable. I really really like the design. And then once we're down inside the city streets here, we are introduced to Cassian Andor, played by Diego Luna. Again, what a great character. Again, Rogue One is populated with so many great characters, played by so many great actors and actresses, giving these incredible performances. And Cassian Andor is no exception here. And I love the edge that he has to him as well. He's fighting on behalf of the rebellion, but you get a very quick and easy sense that he is willing to do pretty much anything on behalf of destroying the Empire and on behalf of the rebellion here, because he's meeting this informant, learning about Galen Erso, the Kyber crystals, a weapon called the Planet Killer, stuff like that. And when Diego Luna, or when Cassian Andor is confronted, by stormtroopers, not only does Cassian just dump them, to get rid of the Imperials, but his informant here, who's freaking out, saying, "Oh my gosh, you just alerted the Empire. What are we gonna do? How are we gonna get out of here?" Cassian Andor is like, "Look, it's gonna be okay. It's gonna be okay." Boom, literally shoots him in the back. Dumps him, because Cassian realizes, he can't take his informant with him. Even if he wanted to, time is of the essence. The information is of high importance. His informant, as he said, is wounded. He has a bad arm for some reason. And he's freaking out. He's semi-hysterical, realizing that the walls are closing in. And Cassian realizes he doesn't have the ability to take himself and his informant with him. And so rather than leave him alive to be tortured, to maybe, give up the whereabouts of the rebellion, and to give up the whereabouts of where Cassian's going next, Cassian just dumps him, just shoots his informant in the back. Better to tie up a loose end than to leave it as a loose end. And so again, this is one of our heroes. This is a rebellion fighter, but we're seeing very early on that he's willing to do what he has to do to get the job done. And it's a great, great character trait. What a great introduction to the character again, with Diego Luna giving a all-star performance. And I love the fact that Cassian Andor is just straight to business. Give me the info. Stormtroopers are here. Boom, boom. They're dead. Oh, now we need to escape, but I can't bring you with me. Sorry, but bam. Yeah, you're my friend. Yeah, you're my partner, perhaps even fighting alongside the rebellion. But the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. And for Cassian Andor to just be introduced this way, I think is really, really awesome. We now go on to the planet Jeddah. Again, so many cool locations in this movie as well too. Jeddah is a really interesting planet because it's clearly established as some type of historic or significant planet and location to the Jedi, ideology. Even again, just the title alone, the name of the planet, Jeddah, very similar to the term Jedi. We see here as well that there are these huge statues of Jedi that have been carved out of mountains as well. We also find out later in the movie that Jeddah has kyber crystal deposits as well, and so it's entirely possible that Jeddah is maybe once housed, a Jedi temple, that it was perhaps a refuge for the Jedi, that it might have even been one of the original inception points of the Jedi ideology to begin. Again, such a cool thing to introduce to the Star Wars universe, getting just glimpses back into the deep history of the Jedi here. And of course, we now live in the aftermath of the Republic falling, of Order 66, where the Jedi have all been wiped out. As Obi-Wan Kenobi says, they're all but extinct. Well, we're seeing the great remnants of a once great civilization. And yeah, it's just it's really, really cool stuff. Again, Rogue One does so many cool things. And we're like, 15 minutes into the movie. I mean, just crazy, crazy stuff. We then go back to the prison planet where Jyn Erso is being held, and I love the shot that brings us back to the planet's surface. We get to see this huge rolling tank on 8+ wheels. And what's interesting is that this is a Republic era tank now being utilized by the Empire. And so again, Rogue One is blending all these cool designs from every era of Star Wars, essentially. And yes, the Empire has risen, the Republic has fallen. No more clone troopers, there are now just stormtroopers. But we see here that not all vehicle designs are obsolete, not all of them have been replaced, or have been updated. And so this giant mobile transport we see here, this is the juggernaut that we get to see in Revenge of the Sith in Episode 3 during the Battle of Kashyyyk. Kind of a blink and you miss it appearance in the movie, but still looked really cool, sounds really cool, and made for a pretty cool Lego set. I never had that Lego set, but I always wanted one, but what are you going to do? But yeah, I love the fact that the Empire is still utilizing some Republic era things. Some things from the Clone Wars still linger even in the shadow of the Empire here. And yeah, just a really, really cool design. I'm really glad that they did that for us Star Wars fans who love that sense of continuity and the design of a really, really cool vehicle. And then after a brief assault on the Juggernaut, where the rebels, breach the hull and save the prisoners, they want Jyn Erso. I actually want to back up here just for a sec. I always found it kind of funny that a cliche in film, in movies, is that, say there's a prisoner and they're being broken out by some other group and whatnot that clearly are not the group that put them in jail in the first place. They always retaliate. They always start throwing punches. It's like they have to escape everybody, So it's like, Jyn, if someone is trying to break you out of an Imperial prison and is willing to assault a rolling juggernaut tank, why then would you start throwing haymakers and hitting them in the face with shovels and whatnot? If I was Jyn Erso and someone breaches the hull of an Imperial tank and says, "Do you want to get out of here?" I'm going to say, yes, please. Which way, sir? I'm not going to start throwing punches and whatnot. But then we see that little brief action sequence, hand to hand combat, and then we get introduced properly to K2SO, this reprogrammed Imperial droid. He grabs Jenner, so throws her to the ground. And K2SO here is played by Alan Tudyk. He is the voice, and I believe he did mocap for K2SO as well. K2SO is very much the comedic relief. He's given a lot of funny lines in this movie, using to great effect. Again, Alan Tudyk, giving just a great performance. His tone of voice, his mannerisms are all conveyed really well through K2SO. Love the design of K2SO as well. He kind of has this almost skeletal-like structure, with the long arms and kind of the the rounded off face and the deep eye sockets and where a jaw should be, but he doesn't have a traditional jaw because he's a droid and whatnot. But also, just for funsies, K2SO, this type of droid, I forget his actual. I think he's referred to as like an Imperial security droid or prisoner droid, something like that. Well, anyway, in the Star Wars Jedi series of video games, you have Jedi Fallen Order and Jedi Survivor, two games that I think are just freaking tremendous. When you have to battle the K2SO type of droids, they pack a freaking punch. And granted, it's a video game, but you cannot cut them down like battle droids and stuff like that. The K2SO security droids, they mean business. They hit hard, literally. It's cool to see. We get introduced to this type of droid through Rogue One, but then we get to see this type of droid sprinkled throughout other Star Wars media. Again, as I said, this latest batch of video games to come out under LucasArts, and they are a fun and challenging enemy to combat in the games here, and I think they capture that sense of kind of brute strength that K2SO has here, because we see him, literally ragdoll stormtroopers a little later in the movie and, smash computer terminals and all that stuff. Yeah, just a really, really cool design, really, really cool voice for the character. I think K2SO is just a really great addition to the Star Wars universe. And then yet another incredible location that Rogue One presents us with, Yavin 4, the headquarters of the Rebel Alliance here. I just, even just the establishing shot of the ship approaching the planet, love the blue planet, being flanked by this giant orange gas giant here. I love this visual. This is such a cool shot of space, the blackness of space, the blueness of the planet, the redness of the other planet. I just think it's awesome. And the fact that, again, this is Yavin 4, a location that we're shown in A New Hope. That's where the Rebel Alliance has their home base prior to them leading the assault on the Death Star. I just think is really, really cool to see once again. And now we're down on the planet surface of Yavin 4, and this is where stuff gets good, in my opinion. Again, as I said, this is the home base of the rebels that we get to see in A New Hope, and so we get to see this awesome shot of the temple, of the ruins. There's a great musical sting of classic Star Wars music when this appears on screen. We then get to see classic rebel troopers, and look at this guy here, with the his uniform and the big white helmet, the bulbous white helmet in the background there. We have Imperial pilots in their orange jumpsuits, and we got, a giant X-Wing here. And I love this. I love, all the rebels going about their business, readying for battle, preparing the ships, making sure everything is spick and span here. Yes, this is the Rebel Alliance, but it still operates as a quasi-military. I love the dirtiness, the griminess. I love the fact that all this stuff looks like it was pulled straight out of Episode 4, A New Hope. It very much is very uniform with what we know Yavin 4 to look like, and I just think all this stuff here is just great. And furthering my comments on Yavin 4, I love the tactile nature to everything. I love that it all looks real and dirty and lived in. I love that, you can reach out and touch the X-wings and that you can feel the griminess of the stone pillars that build up the hangar and the rest of the base. I love all that stuff. And then you go inside here now and you see Jyn Erso sitting at the large observation table that the characters utilize in Episode 4: A New Hope to watch the Death Star attack at the end of the movie. And so I love that Jyn Erso is sitting at this. I love this locale. I also love the fact too that she is backlit behind one of these giant blue viewing panels, essentially, made up of these this blue glass with these crisscrossing lines. I think that's really cool. Again, very much harkens back to the original Star Wars movie, the original Star Wars trilogy, and so on and so forth. And then you have again her being flanked by another rebel soldier, which I think is really great as well. I love this imagery here. And then we have a brief shot here of another rebel official, a man dressed in white with a white beard. And if I know my history correctly for Star Wars, this guy is meant to be what's his name? He's a General Dodonna, I think is his name. Jan Dodonna. He is someone that we see in A New Hope. He gives a briefing on the Death Star, talking about how the Death Star plans have been acquired by Princess Leia, and he's briefing rebel pilots and whatnot. So again, I love the callbacks to the original Star Wars movie. I love the callbacks to the original trilogy, and I love the fact that we're seeing all these classic era characters in Rogue One here, because as we know, Rogue One runs almost perfectly into A New Hope in terms of storytelling. And so, yeah, everything here, it all being familiar. It's awesome. Nostalgia is a heck of a drug, and seeing just these little bits, like, yes, everyone loves to see, Darth Vader and stormtroopers and all this stuff, and that stuff is great. But these little things, the locations, the minor characters that have less than 2 pages of dialogue, stuff like that. I eat all this stuff up here, and I love their inclusions into this movie. I think it makes the movie all the better for having this stuff in it. And then in that same location, into a similar fashion, we get to see Mon Mothma take center stage here in the movie. I love this shot of her. Love the design of Mon Mothma. Really, really cool character. She is someone that we got to see in the original trilogy. We got introduced to her in Return of the Jedi. She herself gives the briefing on the second Death Star when the rebels are about to attack that one here. Love the fact that she's here, though. She's played by Genevieve O'Reilly, who played her in Revenge of the Sith as well. Then went on to play her in the Andor series as well. Again, I've said it before and I'll say it again. I'll probably say it a few more times too. I love not only the reoccurring locations and the characters, but when they can get the actual actors, to bring back their on-screen presence, I think it's just tremendous. And just having her be a part of this movie again further builds that connective tissue that brings the prequel trilogy to the original trilogy, so on and so forth. Just I love utilizing the legacy characters in the way that they do, and Rogue One does it all in spectacular fashion. I love the fact too that as they're trying to bring as the rebels are trying to bring Jyn Erso into the fold, talking about how they need to get to Galen Erso. They need to find out any information that they can about him. And Saw Gerrera, allegedly has the information, allegedly has a contact point, and so they got to use Jyn to get to Saw, to get to Galen. Well, they're talking about Saw, the rebellion, and Jyn Erso is like, look, he's a rebel too. Why don't you just talk to him yourself? What's the deal here? And I thought you were all singing Kumbaya. And Mon Mothma here says, like, no, like, we split off from him. Saw Gerrera was too extreme, even for us. And so it's interesting too, because the rebellion is the good guys in Star Wars. They fight against the Empire, they fight against tyranny and whatnot. But we see here that again there is some established order to what they do here. They're not trying to fight purely in terms of guerrilla warfare. There is a hierarchy. They have a limit, and apparently we find out that Saw Gerrera has gone too far, or perhaps in the eyes of Saw Gerrera, maybe the rebellion won't go far enough, and then we see here that Saw Gerrera has split off from the rebellion. So there are fractions inside of the greater alliance here, and I think that's a really cool element as well. And yeah, again, just seeing Mon Mothma, talk about Saw Gerrera is really cool, but. I also like just the other rebel generals we get to see as well throughout the movie. There's one here, General Draven, played by Alistar Petrie. I love his mannerisms, love his tone of voice. I think he's great. I think he brings a really strong presence to the movie. He brings a strong presence to just being a high-ranking rebel. He acts how I think a rebel should be, with a sense of authority, but also with a sense of caution and suspicion as well. I really like it. Yeah, the tones of Rogue One that they bring to the Empire and to the Rebel Alliance, I think are just done to perfection, to be honest. Again, as I said, Rogue One really does feel like Star Wars, in my opinion. It really plays like Star Wars. And little things like that, little bits of tone and atmosphere that characters bring to the table, I think, goes a long way for this movie. And so now we're getting a greater sense of the overarching plot of the movie. That Jyn Erso says, "What does this have to do with my father? What does Saw Gerrera have to do with my father?" It's not just that he himself has a point of contact. It's not like he could just call up Galen Erso on his flip phone, and be like, "Hey man, what's going on?" No, that there's another string to this web. There is an Imperial pilot who we did see briefly in the movie, though I haven't talked about him yet. I will, though. I will give him his flowers. He's played by Riz Ahmed. And so there's this pilot who had this contact with Galen Erso. The pilot defected. This Imperial pilot defected. He is now in the hands of Saw Gerrera, and we're told very plainly by General Draven that Cassian Andor's mission is to reach the pilot, reach Saw Gerrera, authenticate the pilot's story, and eventually, hopefully, get Galen Erso to come with them to help him escape and testify to the Senate about the creation of the Death Star. So again, this isn't guerrilla warfare just for the sake of guerrilla warfare. Though we find out that there are other sub objectives to this mission as well. But on its surface, what's being presented to Jyn Erso is not to eliminate Saw Gerrera, not to eliminate Galen Erso. It's actually to broker essentially from a peace with Saw Gerrera to get access to this defecting pilot, who could then get us to Galen Erso, who we could then bring back to the Senate, and we can try to win the battle in terms of the government and whatnot. Well, we find out that of course that's not the case, and that Cassian Andor has other things he needs to do, other orders he's going to be given by the generals, and then of course it all leads into the battle of the Death Star and New Hope. But yeah, it's really interesting to see the inner workings of the story, and again, the way it's presented to us is really straightforward. It's pretty easy to follow, and again, that's just not only is the writing good from a dialogue perspective, but a literal descriptive storytelling perspective. It's like, look, there's A, there's B, and there's C, and then also with C, there's now C.1, and that feeds into D, and then from D to E to F, and it's like it all just tracks. And so yeah, Rogue One is just continuing to be a really, really fun ride. And now, by doing this, Jyn Erso says, "What's in it for me?" If she's able to broker this deal, this meeting between Saw Gerrera, what's in it for me? The rebellion promises that she will be able to go free. How are they actually gonna, make that happen? Who knows? But like that gives her a personal incentive to do this as well. Though again, trusting, in the rebellion and versus trusting in the Empire, your options aren't great. It's not like the rebels have this perfect record, because again they're fighting, they're David versus Goliath, but this gives a personal incentive to Jyn Erso. But to cap off that scene, we see Senator Bail Organa come into screen here, played by Jimmy Smits, and he is the adoptive father of Princess Leia. He's a member of Alderaan. He represents Alderaan and all that stuff, and he was in Revenge of the Sith, Episode 3. And so, again, yet another legacy character played by the original actor who betrayed him. It's just awesome. There's a very good musical sting as well with Bail Organa coming onto screen. Just seeing characters like that, seeing those familiar characters with those familiar faces, they just bring a smile to your face, and Bail Organa is no exception. I love this overhead shot here of the flight deck where all the rebel ships are held. Again, it all looks real. It looks like you can touch it. Like you got the X-wings down in the bottom right, and then you have front and center. You have a new ship that we haven't seen before called the U-wing as well. It's, they're expanding the rebels' fleet and whatnot. And then up in the top left there, if you look and see the front end of that ship there, that is actually a ship from the Star Wars Rebel series called the Ghost, utilized by a Rebel strike force. So again, that is another callback to yet another animated series set in the Star Wars universe. So it is, again, just as how Saw Gerrera blends in the Clone Wars TV show into live action. Just that little shot there, that little bit of that ship that we see, the Ghost up in the top left, further blends yet another animated show into the fold of live action. And again, I'm a super fan that I know that I don't even need to see the full ship. I just need to see the front end of the ship. I need to see the back end. I know that is the Ghost from Star Wars Rebels, and that's pretty sweet. But yeah, look at this shot. This is such a cool shot. The colors, the lighting, it's incredible. To me, this is movie magic. This is Star Wars magic, and it's just this is some good stuff here. Here we now see one of the sub objectives I was talking about earlier. How General Draven comes back out to meet Cassian before he fully departs. Talks about how forget what you heard in the briefing room. There will be no extraction of Galen Erso. He is vital to the Imperial weapons program. You must eliminate him. You are going to do that. Those are your orders. And yeah, so the plot thickens in terms of Rogue One here, and I love this extra added element here. I really enjoy this character beat here too of Jyn Erso and Cassian Andor boarding the U-wing, and Jyn Erso, she finds a blaster. She says that she finds a blaster, and Cassian's like, "What? You can't have that. Give that to me." And Jyn Erso says, "Look, we're going to Jeddah. We're going to find Saw Gerrera. This is a war zone. We're going to. You know, I should be armed, and I know how to use it." And Cassian's saying, like, "That's what I'm afraid of." Jyn Erso says, "Look, trust." Trust goes both ways, and so I like the fact that, yes, they are fighting on the same side technically. They're both doing something on behalf of the rebellion, but, for right now, they have ulterior motives. Jyn Erso is doing this to maybe find her father, hopefully rescue him, and then, hopefully get free herself. Cassian Andor, on paper in the boarding room, he's using, his mission is to extract Galen. Well, he just got told, seconds before boarding the shuttle here that now his new objective is to kill Galen. That he's too valuable here. So both Jyn and Cassian, again, on the same side technically, but still kind of at each other's throats. Still are holding blasters to each other, so to speak. And they are allies, but it doesn't mean that they have to necessarily like each other. But this is a good character beat here. And then K2SO later talks about how could you let her keep that blaster? The probability of her using it against you, and for a comedic beat, he says, it's high. It's very high that she's going to use that against you. Again, Alan Tudyk lending his services as a point of comedy here. And then I like the music swelling as takeoff begins. This shot, though, of the rebel pilot rebel pilot, of the rebel soldier sitting up in this watchtower here inside this crow's nest. He's tracking the U-wing, leaving the planet. Again, very, very classic Star Wars imagery here, because the same rebel soldier, they do a very similar thing with the Millennium Falcon and A New Hope when the Falcon approaches Yavin, and so getting to see that kind of imagery again, it presses all the right buttons for us Star Wars fans. And yeah, Rogue One is just the gift that keeps on giving. We then go back to Jeddah, where we, re-meet Saw Gerrera, and we get introduced properly to Bodhi Rook, the Imperial pilot who defected, and he's played by Riz Ahmed. Great character, great actor. What more can I say about what Rogue One brings to the table here? We do see a new look for Saw Gerrera here. He now has hair, even though, when we first saw him many years ago, decades ago, when Jyn Erso was still, a child, uh, Saw Gerrera was bald, yet now he appears to be older and has hair and it's all gray and whatnot. What's interesting is that if you know any of the behind the scenes stuff about Rogue One went through a lot of reshoots in terms of its production. Now, that in of itself, not a big deal. Believe it or not, this is a true thing, so you should believe me, but believe it or not, movies have reshoots literally baked into their production schedules. So whenever you hear or see a headline about, oh no, this movie is going back for reshoots, 9 out of 10 times, it's already been pre-planned out. Reshoots do not mean trouble. They do not mean, we need help, stuff like that. Reshoots are literally baked into the cake for almost all movies. Are there exceptions? Sure, there might be things where it's like, oh, we forgot to do this thing, or this thing is better. Quick, let's go back and, quickly get something else. But for most movies, 9 out of 10, reshoots are already pre-planned before cameras ever start rolling on principal photography. Well, for Rogue One, they went through a lot of reshoots. Depending on what you read and what you believe, it was more so than, say, your average movie. Depending again on what you watch or read, roughly a third was reshot, roughly a half of the movie was reshot. Who knows? But Saw Gerrera and his contributions to the movie were part of the reshoots. And I think that is evident by the hairstyle. I'm not saying it's necessarily a continuity error because, again, they stitch all together with the passage of time. But if you go back and if you watch the trailers for Rogue One, you'll hear lines of dialogue from Saw Gerrera that are not in the movie. You will also see shots of him that are not in the movie, and you'll see him have different hairstyles as well, depending on which trailers you watch as well. And so I think depending on certain characters' appearances and what they say, you can almost see the invisible lines of where the principal photography was and reshoots were. And there's a lot of stuff that was allegedly reshot in terms of Rogue One, and I'll comment on it as I go throughout the movie here. But Saw Gerrera is one of those elements, and so yeah, it's kind of interesting that he was bald in one scene, has hair in the other, and yes, there is some time passage, but behind the scenes, the real answer is because, well, we might be seeing two different iterations of the story more or less here, and it's just it's an interesting tidbit. And then also, one of the characters in his kind of rebel cell here, his name is known as two tubes and whatnot. He's an alien that has literally two tubes coming out of his mouth. I believe he is a character that we first meet in The Force Awakens. I feel like I've forgotten to mention that, but that character design, if it's not literally him in The Force Awakens, it's someone of his species. He does look familiar, and so again, Rogue One utilizing these elements from all throughout the Star Wars saga, including the creature designs as well. Oh my gosh! Now this shot here of the Star Destroyer coming out of the shadow of the Death Star. I mean, mm, that is some good stuff right there. I mean, oh, the visuals of Rogue One. It's just a gift that keeps on giving. Now this point here again, kids. This is the reminder of the power of seeing these legacy characters and seeing the actors, air quote actors, playing these characters as well, because again, as I mentioned, if you watch the trailers from Rogue One, you'll see different shots of the movie that are not in the finished product. However, one thing I don't think we saw at all in the marketing of Rogue One was the inclusion of Grand Moff Tarkin. And so for me, getting to see this character and to hear his voice, to literally hear a representation of the original actor's voice, who I believe his name was Peter Cushing back in the original, New Hope from '77. getting to see this character with that voice was a huge deal. And again, this shot right here of his reflection, in the screen of the Star Destroyer looking out across the Death Star, that would have been enough. That would have been enough for me to have been completely and fully satisfied with the inclusion of Tarkin, because again, this was a genuine surprise. In the same way, getting to see Mon Mothma and Bail Organa and all these guys, this was a true and genuine surprise. And so I was not wishing for anything beyond just this simple inclusion. On top of that, as I mentioned, the actor from the original '77 movie, Peter Cushing, he passed away. So the original actor is not with us. He couldn't come back to the role even if he wanted to. Yet, as we see here, as Tarkin turns into full profile, we get a fully digital character. Grand Moff Tarkin in Rogue One is a fully digital recreation using the likeness of the original actor and his voice on behalf of Peter Cushing's estate, and utilizing deep fake technology and AI and all that stuff. I mean, this is a big deal. Literally, in a way of respect, bringing someone back from the dead to continue in the character, to continue in the arts. We don't see this all the time, but for something like this, to where I feel that the character is warranted in the story, I think that this works to freaking perfection. I think the presence of Tarkin is really well utilized. Having him being in Rogue One, because we know that he's such a strong presence in A New Hope, makes total sense. And again, for this movie, with Rogue One running right up into A New Hope the way it does, this makes complete and total sense. But again, having a literal digital recreation of someone who has passed away look this good. And again, this movie is 10 years old, and to have the effects stand up as well as it does, it's a triumph. It is a triumph to the visual effects artists, to the studio, to the estate. The fact that this works as well as it does, I think, is astounding. And the fact that we got to see more of Grand Moff Tarkin in a new Star Wars movie is just crazy. I also love the fact too, the appeal back to politics in Star Wars. The prequel trilogy got maligned for its reliance on politics, talking about senates and all that stuff. But A New Hope also has to do with the Senate as well. It talks about aboard the Death Star, how the Senate has been disbanded, how the Emperor just waved his hand and said, no more Senate, no more delegating bodies. I am the Emperor. Yet now in Rogue One, which again, takes place prior to A New Hope, Grand Moff Tarkin here, though I believe he is referred to as governor in this movie. But Tarkin says, look, Director Krennic, you've lost an Imperial cargo pilot. You have a defector. If that person were to speak and that gets back to the Senate and they discover the truth behind our weapon, behind our creation, that could cause a lot of problems. And then Director Krennic, very funny enough and accurately enough, says by the time this weapon is fully operational, the Senate won't matter. So he's he's battling Tarkin on an intellectual level, which is great. He does that all throughout the movie, Director Krennic. But it's really interesting. He's literally foreshadowing what is to come. His smokescreen is, who cares what they say? We'll have a Death Star. Then that comes to pass. In A New Hope, we find out that the Emperor has just said, no more Senate. We have a Death Star. And I find that to be really interesting. And I love the classic Imperial way of conducting themselves. Tarkin says, we can't have any more delays, no more issues. This station has to come online. Let's do a firing test. Now we know in A New Hope that, the destruction of Alderaan is the first, firing test of the Death Star's full scale, full ramp up power. But the destruction we're going to see a little bit here in Rogue One, when the blast is targeted towards the Jeddah, that's just like a single engine, ignition, a single reactor ignition, and Tarkin very, accurately, says, it's time for a demonstration. Failure, to follow through will result in you explaining this to a much less patient audience. He's talking about how he'll have to explain this to Darth Vader and to the Emperor, and Tarkin is as we know, he's controlling the Death Star with a an iron like grip, unbeknownst to Director Krennic, because for Krennic this is his installation, and he, like I said earlier, he's having this intellectual battle with Tarkin, but as we know, Tarkin is looking to supersede him in any way possible, and that's what happens. But I love how even amongst the villains there's this inner squabbling, this constant thing about, you might be in control now, but let's see how long that lasts. Stuff like that. I love the dialogue between them. I love their back and forth. And yeah, again, kids, the writing of Rogue One is just amazing. I think also what we see in this next sequence here, this flashback sequence to a young Jyn Erso and a young Galen Erso and Lyra Erso, is that this is set during the time that Galen is still working for the Empire. And what's interesting is everything going on in the background. That's what grabs my attention, because it appears that this flashback is set on Coruscant. And again, if that is Coruscant, and I have no reason to believe that it wouldn't be, because after the events of Revenge of the Sith, the Empire, really their home base is more or less Coruscant. That's where the Emperor has his personal chambers. That's where the Jedi Temple was destroyed and all that stuff. So it would make sense that all these important meetings would reside on the most important planet under the Empire's control, that being Coruscant. But again, just the background shots here, the skyline and the cityscape, the way the buildings are kind of presenting themselves. I do think that this is meant to be Coruscant, and if it is, then that's just another direct callback again to Revenge of the Sith, which is a great additional bridge for the prequel. So yeah, again, just everything Rogue One does to tie it all together, I really really appreciate. And then as we return to Jeddah in the next scene, as I said previously, the landscape shots, the establishing shots of all these locations in Rogue One is really exquisite. And I love the landing sequence of the U-wing. You can tell that this was a real location. I'm not sure exactly what desert this was shot in, but again, it all looks real. It looks like you can touch it. It looks like you could go find it on Earth. And the landing sequence of the U-wing shadow across the landscape, and then the actual touchdown itself, pretty resemblant of the landing sequence of Padme Amidala's starfighter from the Phantom Menace when they touched down on Tatooine from Episode 1. Even if that's not a direct callback, just the way the ship literally swoops in, touches down with the sand blowing underneath, I think is kind of a nice visual callback. But the shot in question I'm really targeting here is the when Cassian and Jyn get out of the ship and they're overlooking this cliff face here. They're seeing Jeddah City, and as the camera pans up, you see the Star Destroyer looming over the city with all the ships going to and from it. And I love this shot. The roughness, the muted color of the earth below, the city carved out of the rock, the brown mountain with the blue sky, and then the hulking nature of the gray Star Destroyer overhead. I think is such a great shot in terms of all it's capturing. It's not close up; it's far away. You're getting a full profile shot of a Star Destroyer, and then with the colors again as well. I think it's just a really good frame, and I love this shot in particular. I think it's really really appealing to the eye. This sequence right here, the cameo of the two criminals that we're going to see in A New Hope, I never really liked this. Yeah, and I say that kind of passively because that implies that I dislike it. And on the contrary, I don't dislike it either. I'm kind of indifferent on this. On one hand, I like the cameo nature because you get to see characters from A New Hope. We get to see characters that directly interact with Luke Skywalker in the cantina. These are the guys that are pushing Luke Skywalker around, Obi-Wan Kenobi then intervenes and says, this one isn't worth the trouble. Now let me get you something. Then we see Obi-Wan, or should I say Ben Kenobi, take out his lightsaber, cut off so-and-so's arm, and there you go. So it's a direct callback to A New Hope, and it got a pop from my theater when I saw it, back in 2016, and people, went, because it's nice seeing familiar faces. However, it's like it's like the idea that these guys went straight from Jeddah to Tatooine, a little far fetched if I want to take it seriously, because again, in the context of A New Hope, they're they're bullying Luke Skywalker, and what's his face is like, don't mess with me, I have the death, I have a death sentence on 3 systems, you know, and Luke's like, I'll be careful. So and so says, you'll be dead, and all that stuff, So again, it does make the universe feel kind of small. The fact that our characters then run into these guys, and then just, a little bit of time later, in terms of Star Wars, Luke Skywalker then runs into them as well. That's if I'm putting on my thinking man's hat, But for the sake of just fun for the movie itself, yeah, like I said, it's fun to see these characters. It's like, oh, we're gonna see them. I know who those guys are, And so it's nice to see them from a nostalgia purpose. I do just think this might be just a bit of extra frosting we just don't need. It's a little much on a cake that's already sweet. But again, it's nice that they're there. I don't really think that it's needed at the end of the day. And now at this part in the movie, this is where we get to meet one of the standout characters from Rogue One, in my opinion. We get to meet Chirrut, played by Donnie Yen, and he himself gives an incredible performance for a truly incredible character, in my opinion. I think Chirrut is just remarkable because, again, to the average person who watches a Star Wars movie, they might think that anyone who has a connection to the Force must either be a Jedi or a Sith. Well, we come to find out that people like Chirrut, they might have an inkling towards the Force. They're Force sensitive. They might even utilize the Force to a degree. Yet that doesn't necessarily mean that they are a Jedi or a Sith. In fact, as I said earlier, the Force really is Star Wars versions of faith, and that we're now establishing that there are people who can believe in the Force, and acknowledge the Force, like Jyn Erso's mother and like Chirrut, but they don't necessarily fall into someone who's going to go wield a lightsaber for good or evil. And Chirrut here, we see that he is a blind man, yet he's able to perceive Jyn in a crowded area, and he knows that she has a necklace on, and he knows that the necklace she has is a kyber crystal, which is significant for the Jedi because, as I said earlier, the kyber crystals hold immense power. They're able to power a Jedi's lightsaber, and they're also part of the firing mechanism for the Death Star. And Chirrut, he says here, the strongest stars have hearts of kyber. So he has an acknowledgement of the Jedi, of their practices, of the Force, and he's a deep believer, and he has a connection to the Force that doesn't necessarily present itself as Force push, lifting things, so on, but it essentially gives him insight, and I find that that's a really interesting character trait. And I think he's a great character because he is showing us a representation of the Force that has not been common to the Star Wars universe, really until this movie. Now, what follows immediately after this is a really quick line, but in my opinion, a really, really important one. Jyn Erso asks, who are they? And Cassian Andor seemingly knows them, knows Chirrut, or maybe knows of them. He calls them, the guardians of the wills, protectors of the Kyber temple. Now, I'm going to get really nerdy here for a second, but if you know your Star Wars history, you know that George Lucas, when he was drawing up the original template for Star Wars, when he was actually writing the script, devising the story of what would become the Star Wars saga, he had this idea that Star Wars would literally be told as a fairy tale, as in someone else was reading the story of Star Wars. So for us, what we watch, episodes 4, 5, 6, so on and so forth, those are literally just stories. And a remnant of that remains, as we see from the opening, uh, you know, uh, text that says, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Again, appealing back to the fairy tale nature. Well, in Star Wars, the Whills, spelled Whills, the Whills are essentially more or less the gods of the Star Wars universe. They are the omnipotent beings that are either a physical representation of the Force, they can manipulate the Force to their will, pun intended, and they are ones that catalog history throughout Star Wars. They are essentially the guardians of the Star Wars galaxy, more or less. They are godlike beings, and George Lucas eased back on that as he developed the Star Wars idea into what we now know, love, and have today. But the will still exist as a kind of concept of this type of guardian, of this type of omnipotent type being in the Star Wars universe, which you can explore throughout the Clone Wars series. There is a brief collection of episodes, I believe, in the 6th season where Yoda encounters them directly. And that's really interesting. But for Cassian Andor to say that, such a quick throwaway line has really deep implications because this is a reference back to one of George Lucas's literal ideas, the idea that Star Wars itself was essentially going to be a journal from another alien species, and all that. So yeah, it's just again, it's just a line. It's a blink and you miss it. You might not even fully hear it in the in the dialogue. If you're just kind of passively watching. But as I've been intently watching throughout this analysis of the movie, I picked up on that line, perhaps for the first time ever, and I was like, "Whoa, that's a deep, deep, deep reference. That goes down to the bone marrow." So yeah, it's pretty interesting. But again, it establishes that Chirrut and others like him are not necessarily Jedi. They are more so meant to be just guardians or custodians of the Force itself, and I find that to be really, really interesting. This whole sequence here of the urban warfare, with the Imperial tank versus Saw's rebels, really, really good stuff. I love the sense of scale, the debris going on. You can tell everything that's happening in this. You don't get lost in the action, and there are some really good character beats. We see Jyn Erso save a young child, which is fantastic. That's what you want to see your heroes doing. But then also Cassian Andor. Um, uh, Saves Jyn Erso at one point throughout this battle because there's one of Saw's rebels, one of the extremists, is up on this catwalk and he's about to toss this grenade onto the Imperial tank, and you're probably thinking like, wasn't that good? Like, what the heck is going on? Like, you toss a grenade into some stormtroopers, then there you go, you take out five in one shot. Well, Jyn Erso has been using this tank for cover, and so if this rebel here were to throw this grenade into the pile of stormtroopers next to the tank, odds are Jyn Erso is going to get taken out as well. And so Cassian Andor then blasts this rebel, knocking him off the catwalk here, and just has the grenade just fall into what looks like a fruit stand more or less. And Jyn and Cassian share this knowing look of like, you did that, you saved me, yep, we're good, now let's get on the move. And you've got two tubes observing this whole deal. But it's a great bit inside of a great sequence. And yeah, the action of Rogue One just does not disappoint in any capacity. And continuing on with this battle, we just have more great combat. We got the ATST that comes in, and provides reinforcement for the Empire. Again, love seeing legacy type stuff, whether it's characters or vehicles. It's really great. And then, we get into these nice tight corridors here where we see Jyn Erso really, show off her hand-to-hand combat, because at some point she essentially picked up this truncheon or this nightstick and is utilizing it against the stormtroopers and whatnot. And it's a great sequence for her. And then she follows it up by shooting an Imperial security droid that looks just like K2SO. It drops dead, and everyone kind of gasps and holds their breath and whatnot, because oh my gosh, did K2 just get shot? And And K2 is like, "Did you know that wasn't me?" And they're like, "Of course we didn't," ha ha, and it's like, oh, they almost accidentally didn't kill K2. And then of course K2 walks up, and all this stuff, and Cassian's like, "I thought I told you to stay with the ship," and K2 says, "Well, it got boring." Well, then just as he's saying that, another squadron of stormtroopers comes around the corner, tosses a grenade. K2 catches it like a freaking baseball and just tosses it back over his shoulder, killing all the stormtroopers, and it's freaking sweet. I mean, it's just again, K2SO is the comedic relief. He has this kind of banter, these kind of quick, quippy things, and just to see him so quickly and effortlessly kill a whole bunch of stormtroopers made for a really fun moment as well. My mom always liked this moment here where, now after the battle, K2, Cassian, and Jin, they're walking through the city streets and they come across more stormtroopers trying to look all inconspicuous. They get spotted, and then K2, he tries to play the part of a security droid for the Empire, saying, "Oh, they're prisoners. We're just making our way through. No reason to talk to us. Move along, type stuff. You know, and and with the role of Jin and Cassian, they're playing prisoners. Kate, Cassian starts talking and whatnot, and then K2, trying to play up the part, slaps Cassian across the face and says, "Be quiet, prisoner." And there's a fresh one if you mouth off again. My mom always liked that moment where K2 just gives Cassian a good hard smack across the face, just really suddenly. She always liked that moment, and I did too, and I think it's quite funny. And then, of course, this sequence here with the return of Chirrut. I mean, just incredible stuff here. Again, the blind man with just a stick, not even a lightsaber, just with a stick, is able to take on all these stormtroopers. And Donnie Yen does this in spectacular fashion. And I love how they show that even though he's blind, he still has his hearing and he still has his senses because he's essentially able to use the Force, in my opinion, to perceive all of this stuff. He's hearing their blasters cock. He's hearing the feet of the stormtroopers crunch the sand beneath their feet, and stuff like that. And there's even a bit here where he purposely he anticipates the shot first of a stormtrooper before it actually comes. So he knows which one is going to fire before the firing actually happens. And that's again another reference back to the Clone Wars, to where Anakin Skywalker is training Ahsoka Tano, and they're using stun rounds, dummy rounds, because they're fighting with clone troopers. They're training for the war and whatnot. And Anakin says that to survive, you have to anticipate the shot of the first soldier. You have to know who's going to shoot first before they even know. And Ahsoka's able to use the Force to perceive that. And in the same way, Chirrut is as well, because he knows which stormtrooper's going to fire first. He knows which one to dodge first, which one to take out first with his staff, and then he goes on and does the rest of that. So again, he might not be a Jedi, but he has that same kind of perceptive abilities as a Jedi would to handle a situation, and I think it's really awesome. And then after that initial action sequence with Chirrut handling the first squadron of stormtroopers, a whole other squadron comes running around the corner, and then it looks like he's going to be taken out. But then thankfully he has his companion, the character of Baze Malbus. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. Played by Jiang Wen, and I am hopefully pronouncing that correctly as well. I apologize if I'm not, but he is another great actor that provides another great performance for yet another great character in Rogue One, and he is one of the Guardians of the Wills alongside Chirrut here. They kind of go hand in hand. He's kind of the protector, the eyes of Chirrut more so. And yeah, Chirrut can definitely handle himself, but Baze here is kind of the muscle, very much the Chewbacca to the Han Solo, if you will. They're two peas in a pod, and they love to have a banter between each other, and he's great. And the way he disbands the stormtroopers, with he seemingly just holds down the trigger on this big, awesome blaster he has. This thing has its own power pack. It's not just another pistol. This thing is like a full on like machine gun type thing. And what's interesting too is that if you notice in the background, this whole entire sequence has been set amongst the backdrop of a downed X-wing. There's actually an X-wing that is like that has crash landed in the streets here of a Jeddah city. And this is where all this is happening. So yeah, I find it interesting that again, in all the times I've watched Rogue One, I don't think I've ever fully noticed that there was a rebellion ship here in Jeddah. So at some point there was some kind of attack that went down, some kind of rebel strike, and yeah, just to have this character introduction set amongst that backdrop, I think is really cool. And what just follows is an example of the banter I'm talking about here, because Cassian sees Chirrut, handle the stormtroopers despite being blind. And, Cassian straight up asks him, is he a Jedi? And Baze, corrects him and says, there are no more Jedi here. Not anymore. There's only fool believers, like him, you know. And Chirrut retorts by saying, well, the Force protected me. And Baze said, I protected you. So Baze, if he's not outright a guardian of the will, which I do believe that he is, because again, Cassian referred to Chirrut and to the person flanking him, that being Baze, as a guardian of the will. If they are both still guardians of the wills, the protectors of the Kyber temple, then Baze has certainly had a crisis of faith, because, again, this is in the aftermath of Order 66, as you just said. There are no more Jedi. So whatever Chirrut is, he's someone who just happens to believe too much in the Force, according to Baze. And the Force didn't protect you, I protected you. But Cassian sees the inherent abilities of Chirrut, and questions, is he a Jedi? What is this? And Chirrut, just kind of smiles and fully puts the all the all the credit towards the Force. But Baze, he's a little jaded to this, and it's an interesting character dynamic that equals for some good dialogue and some further good exploration on these characters. And I like this little bit too, to where they're all communicating with each other. Cassian, Jin, Baze, Chirrut, and they're all talking about Saw Gerrera. Can you get us to Saw's rebels? And then boom, they show up, and they're saying, take us to Saw Gerrera. And the rebels black bag everyone there, to protect the location and whatnot. And they black bag Chirrut, and he's like, are you kidding me? I'm blind, and it's funny. It's good. It's a good joke. Why cover the eyes of a blind man? So again, kids, Rogue One has some incredible writing in it. And boom, the movie just confirms, a little segment I just said earlier, talking about Baze having a crisis of faith. Now our heroes are captured; they're being held by, Saw's rebels. Then they're in their cell, and Chirrut is saying, I'm one with the Force. The Force is with me. He's repeating this mantra, and Baze is like, really, you're praying? Like, are you kidding me? And Chirrut retorts him by saying, Baze was once the most loyal guardian of us all. He had the strongest faith. He had the strongest belief. And now again in the aftermath of Order 66, as the flag of the Empire, reigns across the galaxy, as Saw Gerrera says, he lost that faith. Now he's questioning this stuff, and now he's chalking it up to, to believing in falsehood. To have this kind of faith in the Force, is to be a fool, essentially. And again, it's fun, quippy dialogue, but there's a lot of meaning behind it. There's a lot of meat on these bones here. And yeah, Rogue One, nothing is wasted in this movie, by no means. And this line is really important for a lot of different reasons. This is an interesting shot here of the Death Star hovering over Jeddah. I like this because the Death Star is freaking upside down. It's upside down, which makes sense for what's going to come later. Again, they're going to fire the primary laser. They're going to do a test fire on Jeddah City. But again, just showing us stuff that we know, that we're familiar with. We know what the Death Star looks like, but to have it just be inverted, to see it upside down in a Star Wars movie is just a really cool visual. And then we immediately go inside the Death Star, and we're looking at Director Krennic and Grand Moff Tarkin looking over Jeddah, and Tarkin's talking about how the Emperor is awaiting a report on the firing of the Death Star, And Director Krennic, snaps back and says, "One would think that the Emperor and the Lord Vader would want to be here for a test of this magnitude." And Tarkin says, it's better that they're not here to spare you of any potential embarrassment. And then Krennic again retorts him, saying, your concerns are hardly warranted. They are just having this intellectual mind war against each other. They're just sparring with one another in terms of dialogue, wits, brains. It is some really fun and entertaining stuff to see, and it's great to see this kind of infighting inside of the Empire. It just makes for some really entertaining stuff. And then that bit of dialogue is followed up with the confirmation of the target. We're not going to blow up the whole moon. We're not going to blow up all of Jeddah. We just want to do a single reactor firing sequence so that way we can test the weapon. And so they're going to target Jeddah City, and you can see how Director Krennic orders the charging of the weapon. His Imperial officer then says, we're ready to fire, and Krennic immediately, very quickly, just snaps back, fire. He's upset. He's not saying it with authority. He's saying it like, get it over with, like get on with it. Because you can see here, you can gauge just by how he's talking to his men that Tarkin has gotten under his skin, that he is making him cast doubt on himself, on his stature inside the Empire, on the status of the Death Star, how all he wants is he wants the accolades. He wants to be lauded by the Emperor, by Darth Vader. And Tarkin is saying, if you keep messing up, it's not going to work out well for you. And you say the Death Star is good to go, but we'll see. We'll see. He's making Krennic doubt himself to the point to where he can't even enjoy his own success. And again, it's a testament to some really great acting done on the parts of Ben Mendelsohn with director Krennic, and then the actors who helped bring Grand Moff Tarkin to life. Because again, he is a digital character and whatnot, but there are still people that have to provide reference for the actual on-screen presence, for the mannerisms and all that stuff. So all these characters are portrayed by some incredible performances, and we get to see them on full display in a lot of different ways. This is what I was talking about earlier, this portion of the movie where I feel that there's another accidental callback to The Force Unleashed, perhaps. Again, with the character very accurately named Galen. Again, that's the real name of the character of Starkiller from The Force Unleashed. The Force Unleashed has a very unique look to itself, and Starkiller is included in that. And his uniform is comprised of this black and gray suit, essentially, and the gray more so flows over his shoulders and covers his pecs, essentially. And if you see here in this shot of Galen with the hologram on, and you can see this as the rest of the sequence plays out too, he himself has a very similar designed uniform where it's comprised of black and gray, and the black stops at about the chest line, and then gray kind of flows over the shoulders to kind of accent his chest and neckline. And that's exactly what Starkiller looked like in The Force Unleashed. He had a very similar basic uniform that had that kind of mixture of black and gray with the fabrics overlapping one another. And again, it's in my opinion, it's too much of a coincidence to be a coincidence. You have a character named Galen, who in my opinion is dressed like Galen, and from The Force Unleashed. And in The Force Unleashed, you have a character again named Galen who wears a very similar outfit with the black and the gray. Again, maybe I'm grasping at straws here, but even when I first saw the movie for the first time, I thought they're winking and nodding quite a bit here to The Force Unleashed, in my opinion. And if so, I really enjoyed that. But even if it is a happy accident, well, then I'll take that too. But yeah, it's good to see my one of my favorite gaming series, The Force Unleashed, get some love in the later iterations of Star Wars. This whole sequence here about Galen Erso's message to the rebellion and to Jin is really, really beautiful because on one hand you have the human element of Galen, pleading. He's speaking very hastily to Saw Gerrera, to the rebellion, and hopefully to Jin as well about the plans for the Death Star and then also for the message that he has for his daughter as well. But then you have the large scale element to it as well because while this is happening, we as the audience see that the Death Star is charging. It's preparing to fire onto Jeddah, and our characters don't know what's coming, but we as the audience do, and it really conveys this sense of dread as well. And what really accents this is the music utilized in this scene. It's very subtle but very effective, and as I said, it strikes a great combination of beauty and just incoming dread, since we know what's happening. But I really like this whole sequence. The visuals are great, the sound is great, and just the actual dialogue spoken in it is really impactful as well because while Galen Erso is talking about the flaws of the Death Star, he's essentially pleading his case for this whole thing. He's talking about how after um, his wife was killed, and after he was taken, he assumed that either Jin was lost completely, that she'd be so well hidden amongst the stars that he would never see her again, or that she herself had been captured by the Empire as well. And so Galen Erso was then presented with a dilemma. Is he just going to be forced to work in a form of bondage to the Empire to build this super weapon of mass destruction, or he even proposes the idea that he could kill himself? He outright says that was an option for him, that he considered that. But then there was a third option, and he chose to work for the Empire, but pour himself into his work and become indispensable, so that way he could not get removed from the Death Star project, and he was able to manipulate the system from the inside out, and that's how we have the fatal flaw, of the trench run, and the shot to the reactor core. If you hit it just right with a proton torpedo, the whole thing will explode. It'll produce this chain reaction. And so Galen Erso, despite working against his will for the Empire, he was still able to work for some good, to do some good for the inside. And all the while he's talking about his daughter, and despite him having to do this, he did everything for her, hoping that she will inherit a better tomorrow, and that the Alliance or whoever is receiving this can utilize this information to destroy the Death Star because he knows what's coming. And it's really, really beautiful. And again, this is all set under the backdrop of the Death Star preparing to fire. And again, that's some very iconic imagery from A New Hope, getting to see the Death Star, prepare itself, with all the technicians and stuff, getting the super laser ready. But yeah, it's a great sequence with some great dialogue, some great visuals, and again, the music in particular here is just the cherry on top for all of it. This shot here of the Death Star moving into position over the city, and it becomes a freaking, eclipse across the sun. I mean, just wow, what a shot. I mean, again, Rogue One just continues to outdo itself. And then this sequence, it caps itself off with, Galen Erso telling who's ever listening that, the plans for the Death Star are in the Citadel on the planet Scarif, and they have the schematics to show the rebellion how to get to the reactor, and any pressurized explosion to the reactor will result in a chain reaction that will disable the entirety of the Death Star and destroy it. And then we get to see the shot fired, and the Death Star has unleashed itself onto Jeddah. And I mean, the destructive capability of just a fraction of the Death Star's power is is crazy, and it's a great visual. It's a cool explosion, but it's essentially Star Wars version of a freaking nuke. I mean, it just creates this massive explosion that causes this massive shockwave that is literally eliminating part of the planet, as it's emanating out from its center. I mean, it's removing the horizon here, and like, as K2SO says, he's like, I'm at the ship, I'm scanning the horizon. He's like, but now there's a problem. There is no horizon. So like K2SO can literally see the planet falling apart from the aftermath of this destruction, and now our heroes have to make this mad dash to try to escape. They got to try to get everyone involved. They got to, get Chirrut out, get Baze out, and then they got to rescue the pilot, Rook, and because he'll have information as well that they need. So now it's a race against the clock. This clock of ultimate destruction of this doom that is coming via the Death Star, and of course, Jin, she's crestfallen, because she's seen her father, so to speak, and she knows what's happened to him and what he's been up to, but now, she knows of the destructive capabilities of the Death Star and also, how to defeat it herself, and as they're making their escape from this shot from the Death Star, um, Cassian finds Jin, and Jin turns to Saw and says, come with us, come with us. And Saw, this is another part too I don't really get, because Saw is a freedom fighter through and through, so much so that he fractioned off from the rebellion. Yet now the Death Star has been fired onto Jedha. Our heroes have to escape. Jin turns to Saw and says, "Come with us." And Saw says, "I won't run anymore." And it's like, why? Like now you know that the Empire's super weapon can be destroyed per the architect himself, Galen Erso. And Saw is like, now I'm gonna make my exit. Now I'm not gonna run anymore. They can take me. And it's like, look, it's like now is the time you should mobilize yourself to the quickest ability, because don't you want to be a part of this fight? Don't you want to try to help destroy the Death Star? But whatever. But yeah, we get some more shots here of the impending doom of the explosion, and my gosh, the physics of this thing, getting to see the explosion from the perspective of someone on the ground, like our pilot here, Rook, but then also getting to see the explosion from the perspective of back on the Death Star, with Director Krennic saying, "Oh, it's beautiful." I mean, he's looking at this destruction here, and again, it really does resemble a nuke, and just in how it continues to expand and to grow, and just the clouds it produces. It is freaking terrifying to look at, in a really entertaining way. But then we get to see more shots of the Death Star, its destructive capabilities, the blast continuing to just lift, the planet apart, and it's like, what's going to happen here? We need, a ride, and thankfully K2SO is coming in, and even just the shot of the ship flying amidst the debris is just awesome. Again, the visuals of this are just insane. The way the dust is forming, the clouds, it almost looks like the Earth is acting against gravity, the way it's getting sucked up and lifted up, due to the shockwave and all this stuff. And it's a great classic sequence of, our heroes need to escape an explosion, and it all looks and plays spectacularly. The physics of this destruction is insane here. And yeah, and again, this is just a fraction of the Death Star's power. It's just a single reactor ignition, and yeah, it's nuts here. And then as the sequence goes on, we get to see Saw Gerrera get wiped away by the explosion. He did not want to continue to fight on. Again, I don't really get that, but sure. And then even just this sequence here of the U-wing taking off and now trying to break atmosphere as the destruction, the debris closes in around them. I mean, this stuff here looks like a freaking matte painting. I mean, this is some incredible stuff, and then just flying through the debris, kind of reminiscent also of, the Millennium Falcon dodging the asteroid belt in The Empire Strikes Back, and then the quick shot here to hyperspace, and then getting to see the explosion from orbit, watching the debris, the destructive capability of the shot, literally lift outside of the planet, and now the cloud of debris is drifting up towards the Death Star. I mean, just my goodness, this whole sequence is nothing but just visually stunning. Beyond its storytelling capabilities, it is just incredible to look at, and Yeah, wow. I just again, Rogue One is just the gift that keeps on giving. I mean, holy guacamole. Who knew they can make the Death Star even cooler than it already was? And again, now we're back inside the Death Star, and I love the aftermath of what's just taken place here because you have the Imperial officers, congratulating one another. They're saying, job well done. Wow, could you believe it? It's just the callousness of them, you know, absorbing what they've now just unleashed upon the galaxy is crazy too. But then, of course, you get more of this fantastic sparring match between Tarkin and Krennic, and it appears that Tarkin is finally giving Krennic what he wants. He says, I owe you an apology, Director Krennic. Your weapon has exceeded our expectations. And Krennic immediately, he doesn't say thank you. He doesn't say really or you mean it, like nothing like that. The first thing he says is, will you tell the Emperor as much? Will you convey to the Emperor? Like, again, all he wants is the accolades. It's all he wants. And it's not enough to get it from Tarkin. He has to get it from the top dog, the tip of the spear, that being the Emperor. But then immediately, as Tarkin seemingly gives Krennic praise, as he gives him what he wants, he rips it away, saying that now that the Death Star is seemingly fully operational, Tarkin himself will be taking over the Death Star, and Krennic just loses it in front of his officers and says, we stand here amidst my achievement, not yours. And he puts his foot down. He is marching right up to Tarkin and saying, this is my project, this is my success. Back off. And Tarkin says that, the security breaches that led to this test that required my presence, this cannot be ignored. We now have, a a a pilot who has gone rogue, and we've got Galen Urso who's also defecting as well. Like I need to take over, and Director Krennic keeps saying, whatever security breaches you found, they've been sealed. Jeddah has been silenced, and Tarkin is saying, do you really think he acted alone? Like it. He's saying, it's not over. And Director Krennic, quite literally goes running to the parents and says, we'll see about this, because now he's gonna go confront Galen, then he's gonna go to the top dog, that being, Darth Vader, and hopefully, he'll get an ear with the Emperor. But we of course know how the rest of the movie plans out. But now he himself has to get his hands dirty. He has to go see, is Galen legitimately, the defector? Because apparently that's where this pilot came from, being, Galen's facility on the planet Edu. And then, of course, as I just said, Krennic is eventually going to go to the Emperor, or to Darth Vader, and say, speak on behalf of the Emperor. The Death Star is operational. Please acknowledge me. That's what he's doing, and it's great. It's great, and it's all sparked off. This is the next 20-25 minutes of Director Krennic that we get to see throughout this movie is all sparked off by Tarkin, and it's amazing to see. I love this close-up shot here of the Death Star as Director Krennic's shuttle takes off. I love how literally close we get to the Death Star. We can still see it still being, fully built, fully constructed, and then, we get all the little details of all the hangars and stuff like that. I love seeing the Death Star up close and just getting a real hands-on view for it. I think it's a really really cool shot. Similarly to the previous shot of the Death Star, I love this up close shot, this kind of GoPro style camera, fixed to the wing shot of the U wing here as it's crashing onto the planet Edu. I love the sense of realism that brings, as if the ship is real, everything is real, and I love seeing that this nice close perspective of the ship crashing as opposed to seeing it, from an outward position. I think it's a really cool visual, and Rogue One does this camera angle a few more times, and every time it's done to really good effect here. And so I think it's a great creative decision to every now and then interject a one of these camera shots here. I love this bit of insight here from Chirrut because, now that our heroes have crashed onto the planet Edu, they're all under the assumption that the plan is still intact, that they're going to go and, extract Galen, and now they have to steal a ship to, get off the planet and all that. But we know as the audience that Andor has his own sub-objective. He was given an updated set of instructions by that General Draven, I believe, from Yavin 4, talking about how, hey, look, Galen is too important to you know to be left alive. So if you see him, you kill him. That's it. Forget the extraction. Forget what you heard. And so now that the ship has crashed, Andor is still putting up the bluff of, hey, we just got to go steal a ship, get Galen, and boom, we're gone. Well, he's acting all jaded and all kind of rough to the others, and he's configuring his weapon into a sniper modification. So it's all up for suspect. And Chirrut is wise to this, and he asks Baze, does he look like a killer? And then this makes Jin's ears perk up, and she's like, what was that about? Why would you ask that? And Chirrut says, the Force moves darkly around a creature that is about to kill. And so Chirrut is again he's not a Jedi, but he is 100% Force sensitive through his abilities as a fighter and as someone who's able to perceive things. I mean, he is able to get a readout on stuff that others can't. Despite Chirrut being blind, and it's a great sense of his Force ability to be able to perceive the, I don't know, the inner machinations of Andor, that because we find out that Andor, again, he has his orders from the rebellion, yet he himself is doubting his own orders, and he struggles to choose what to do, and it's interesting that we get to see Chirrut pick up on that, and that gets conveyed to Jin, which leads to the rest of the encounter here. But yeah, it's really interesting to see. This shot here of the Imperial facility on Edu, the one that's been built into the cliffside, this shot reminds me a lot of a visual and, frankly, another facility that you get to encounter as the player when playing Jedi Survivor, the sequel to Jedi Fallen Order. You yourself, as the protagonist of that story, Cal Kestis, you have to infiltrate a Imperial facility that's also built into a cliffside, and it also has kind of this blue hue to everything. And it's a really cool visual. And again, watching the movie now, I see the visual inspiration that Rogue One laid for other Star Wars projects that came in the future. And so I like this shot here, just because it harkens back, or should I say, harkens forward to what's going to come in the future with Jedi Survivor. But yeah, that's a great game, and they have kind of a similar visual motif to Rogue One in a few ways. This shot here is another view of the facility that our heroes are trying to get to. Andor and Bodhi Rook, they took one way to get up onto a ridge so that Andor can eventually take a long shot at Galen Erso to eliminate him. But now Jin is nervous of Andor. She's a little wise to what's going on now because of what Chirrut said, and so she is following them, and she's taking an alternate route to get to the facility. And now this shot here that we're seeing, this is from her perspective. She's on the ground. She's on the bottom of the cliff looking up at the facility, and all those lights there are meant to illuminate rungs on a ladder that she's going to have to climb to get to the facility. And I'm just being for real. I don't mean this as a comment to be a jerky McJerkface, but movies have done this, and Star Wars has done this a few times, to where they show the route that our hero is going to take to get to a certain place, and it looks just insane. That, if I had to climb that ladder, and they show more of it because the shot pans. So imagine this ladder is even longer than what you're seeing in this camera shot here. If I had to climb this ladder, say it's 1,000 rungs to get to this facility, I could not do that. I would get tired. I would get exhausted. On top of that, it's raining. It's going to be wet. You're going to be miserable. And the idea that Jyn Erso can just go deep and climb up all this ladder inside of 5 minutes before Andor can get a shot off. I mean, I just find it ridiculous. And I'm just saying from a literal physical standpoint of like human stamina, I don't think this is possible. But again, I'm looking for this type of logic in a Star Wars movie where ships fly, they have blasters, and people use a thing called the Force. So, again, I'm really, talking to a brick wall here. But I'm just saying, as an observation, um, that's a lot of ladder to climb in wet weather, and I don't think it'd be too easy for our hero to do that. I like this shot here because this is meant to be a literal representation of what it would look like if you were looking down the scope on Cassian Andor's rifle. And I like when Star Wars does this. I like when we get to see what it would be like to actually use technology in the Star Wars universe. And so I like when they show us, shots from inside a cockpit, or we're getting to see what it would look like to use binoculars in the Star Wars universe, or to get to use a scope, for example. And I also just like the actual way this scope is designed. I like the shape of the viewport. I like the colors. I like the green with the red and all that stuff. And hey, look, I wish my actual optic on my personal rifle, looked like this, but that'd be a pretty wild setup. But I want to talk about something a little more serious in nature in regards to this scene. So we want our heroes to react in heroic ways. We want them to react and act in heroic ways, hence why they're heroes. But we know that Cassian Andor has secret objectives because, again, when they got dispatched from Yavin 4 in the boardroom, it was said, your mission is to find Galen Erso and extract him and bring him in for questioning, in front of the Senate. But then, just as they were about to depart, that general comes up to Cassian Andor and says, "Hey, forget what you heard in there. Galen is too valuable to be kept alive. If you see him, you kill him. Sincerely, the rebellion." And of course, he's keeping this a secret and all that stuff because Jyn would be against him and all that stuff. So he's now trying to complete this sub objective that he was given via the general. And we know that Cassian Andor has the capability to just do what is necessary, essentially, because when we first meet him, we see that he is meeting his informant who's telling him about how the Empire has this planet-killing weapon, and the Empire gets alerted to their presence. Stormtroopers are coming in, and his informant, he has a bad arm, he's acting hysterical, and he's like, I'll never be able to get away, they're going to capture me, blah, 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 blah. And Cassian says, hey, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. He gives him false hope. And then immediately after doing that, he literally shoots his informant in the back. Because Cassian Andor realized that in that moment, as the Empire is closing in on their position, one, it's easier for him to get away just by himself as opposed to the two of them. Two, his informant has a bad arm, so the idea of climbing is almost impossible. And three, if the informant were to be captured, he could either be tortured or he could give up information, valuable to the Empire, and could maybe reveal more about the rebellion. And so Cassian Andor literally decides in that moment the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, or the one, and shoots his informant in the back. Is that necessarily a good thing to do? No, but we know that him as a character, he is willing to do what he deems is necessary to get the job done. And would it have been a little tough to fight the general on the flight deck as they're about to take off? What do you mean you want me to kill Galen Erso? I won't do that. Yes, it would have been tough for him to do that. He still could have put up a fight if he wanted to. He still could have questioned the orders. But he just took it like a pill. And then the story goes on from that point. And now we're at this juncture here to where Cassian Andor literally has Galen Erso in his sights. I mean, and this shot here, this is the most clear shot you could possibly get on a target. I mean, he is in a prime position to pull that trigger and to get the job done, to fulfill the orders that the rebellion has set out for him. But he doesn't. Cassian, again, he slips his rifle, he disengages, he doesn't follow through with the orders. And again, this represents character development because, we saw him be upset about having to kill his informant. And, later in the movie, we have him talk about how he's been in this fight against the Empire since he was 6 years old, how he's had to do things he's not proud of, and then he goes on, tells more about that too, about how, you know, he's fighting for a cause that he believes in, but that doesn't mean that all the work he's had to do has been great. He's been a smuggler, he's been an assassin, he's done all this stuff, and so he's maturing as a character into someone who wants to fight for what is right, but not just blindly follow orders, which is admirable, But I I I'm just saying right now, like, look, like, despite everything I just said about being admirable, not blindly following orders, I get that. I'm also just saying though, Cassian Andor is the right man for the job, and personally, I would have taken the shot on Galen Erso. I would have done that because the circumstances I think dictate that kind of action. You just found out that the Death Star, at a minimum, has the ability to drop a nuke on a planet from orbit and destroy a city like Jeddah, and you barely escape that. And Jin is saying how this is a planet-killing weapon. The Death Star is a very accurate name because this has the destructive capability to destroy a planet. So if I knew that the guy in my crosshairs could potentially deliver that kind of destructive force, yeah, I would take the shot to prevent that from happening. But again, this is character development. It's for the sake of the movie. I'm just saying, had the movie gone differently, had Cassian Andor not disengaged, had he taken the shot, I think I would have understood. I think I would have, because I think in this situation, I probably would have taken the shot myself. Because again, this is a very high ranking Imperial who is supposedly the lone architect behind a weapon of massive destruction. And yeah, so it's an interesting dilemma in the character. And again, this is a testament to the creative writing of Rogue One. This is a testament to the great writing. The fact that this singular moment here can have this much of a discussion, stem from it, is a testament to good writing. But I like, Cassian makes the decision that he makes. It's a good decision because he again is growing as a character. I'm also saying though, I think it would also have been a good decision to eliminate such a high value target because the stakes are that high. And I found this point in the movie. I feel that it offered a lot more fruit than was at just on the surface. And yeah, I thought it made for a pretty cool moment. This is another example of one of those GoPro style mounted camera angles that I talked about earlier. I like how Rogue One does this throughout the movie. They just kind of sprinkle them in. And I like the fact too that it's on an X-wing, being a legacy ship design. That's pretty cool. But beyond this shot just being cool, for the purpose of the story, it's actually pretty important because the Rebel Alliance, the last transmission they received from Cassian and his team was that they made it to Edu, but the signal went dead. So for all they know, Cassian and his crew are they're down, they're eliminated. Well, the Alliance needs to initiate an insurance policy essentially on eliminating Galen Erso, and so they scramble this squadron of fighters. So now all these things are going to come to a head. Because as I just talked about, Cassian, could have completed his mission to eliminate Galen Erso, but he backed off. But even though he made one decision, the Alliance made another, and now literally the good guys are going to get caught in the crossfire here as the X-wings come in. And the sequence here is really cool, seeing, X-wings on approach, and there's going to be some cool action and whatnot. But in terms of a story beat, it's also pretty impactful as well. And as if Chirrut couldn't possibly get any cooler, now they established that his staff also has a blaster modification built into it. So the blind man, freaking snipes a TIE fighter out of the air. I mean, my goodness. And then, of course, this TIE fighter crashes into the facility, taking out, some of the Empire's, air support and stuff like that. I mean, it just freaking nuts. I mean, wow, what a cool sequence. What a cool moment from such a cool character. This shot right here of Galen Urso's lifeless body. This is another comment I want to make, very similar in nature to seeing Jin Urso climb, 1,000 ladder rungs to get up to this facility. I mean this sincerely. I've thought this since the day I saw Rogue One for the first time back in 2016. The way Galen Urso dies has got to be so uncomfortable. Look at his death position. One of his feet are pointing towards his head. The bottom of his foot is pointing towards his head. And look, I'm speaking about this in a real context here right now. For filming a scene in a movie, actors have to hold a position for several minutes potentially. They have to, hit their marks and whatnot. And so I imagine that Mads Mikkelsen probably had to lay in this position for, at least a couple of minutes. And man, that just, every time I've seen the movie, I always thought, like, yeah, this is sad, I can't believe it, they lost one on their own, but like, man, that had to be so uncomfortable for the freaking actor to lay that way, to have your foot angled towards your head. I've always thought that it's always stuck out to me. So yeah, what do you know? I love this shot here. This is a real blink and you miss it moment in the movie, but after our band of heroes have escaped in the stolen Imperial shuttle, Jin is looking at Chirrut, and the look on her face conveys this sense of like, you were right, like the feelings you had about Cassian, about, the force moving darkly around him. You were right, he had the face of a killer. The shot in question, though, that I'm talking about is where Chirrut reaches out and grabs her hand, because I get the sense that he can sense her emotions. She is upset at the realization of Chirrut being right. She's upset at the realization that her father is dead, and she is upset at the realization that Cassian had a sub-objective to eliminate Galen, and that he lied to her. He lied to the crew. And the way Chirrut grabs her hand is this moment that just it's literally him reaching out to her, I believe, in a physical way, in an emotional way, in a way that's meant to convey even the force to a degree as well. This whole sense of like, yes, I was right. Yes, you're going to lash out at Cassian, and I'm sorry that your father is gone. He's reaching out for that purpose as well. But I also wonder if he's reaching out to say like, don't, don't lash out at Cassian. I think that him clutching her hand, I think is another one of these moments that on its surface, it just comes and it goes. It exists for 2 seconds, but I think there's a lot more meaning behind it. I think there's a lot more at stake with this gesture, and I like that Chirrut is really he just has this great emotional beat between the two of them. Nothing is said between the two of them. It's really just two characters looking at each other. It's just one character looking at the other, because Jen is looking at him. He's not looking at her, but he's still able to reach out, and this gesture again, the hand holding, I think has so much going on beneath the surface, and I really liked picking up on this moment upon this rewatch. This whole conversation that follows as a result of Jin confronting Cassian about what happened on the surface of the planet, I think is some really good dialogue. Again, I think Rogue One is really well written, and I like that Cassian, they're going back and forth. They're having this sparring match about, you lied to me, I had orders, blah blah blah. But Cassian then flips it back on to Jin and says, suddenly the rebellion is real for you now, because you just lost something. Well, you're not the only one who has lost everything. And then he accents that line by saying, some of us have just decided to do something about it. So like everyone to some degree has lost something under the flag of the empire, but some of them do decide to say enough, or you cannot do that, or this won't stand, hence the rebellion. And so Cassian is saying like, look, I had orders, but like I'm doing something. I'm in the rebellion. I'm a rebel fighter. Jin, you're astray. You're a tag along, on this whole thing. I really like this whole moment here because again, you have two actors playing two great roles, delivering great dialogue in this nice confined setting, and it just lets the emotion of everything just hang in the air, and I think it's a great cherry on top to this really emotional sequence. And then this next moment here, the next scene we transition to, in the same way I did not expect to see Tarkin in Rogue One, I absolutely did not expect to see Mustafar in Rogue One. Again, further tying this movie back to the prequels because we just saw Mustafar in episode 3. It's where the climactic showdown takes place. Obi-Wan, Kenobi, Anakin Skywalker, the whole deal. It's where Darth Vader, is born essentially. And to revisit the planet, freaking sweet. But now to see that Vader has a presence on this planet, literally, because, Krennic is approaching Vader's castle, which becomes a very interesting location throughout the Star Wars universe going forward. Yeah, just what a cool, mysterious thing to include here. Just expanding the dark side of the Force, expanding the character of Vader. It's freaking sweet. What a cool addition. I love the fact that there is something new built upon something old. Again, the castle on Mustafar. I think it's all great. And then this shot here, going inside of the castle now and seeing, a back to tank, which we know houses Anakin Skywalker out of the suit of Darth Vader and being flanked by two red royal guards. Just awesome, awesome stuff. Love it all. I just think it's a great look, great design. I think it's sweet, and also the fact again that we're getting to see more of prequel era stuff. Not just Vader in the suit, but we are getting to see the man beneath the mask. We're getting to see more glimpses of Anakin Skywalker. We're getting to see Darth Vader in a vulnerable position. He's out of his armor, hence why he needs this insane level of protection, with the Red Royal Guards. I just love that. I just think it's great. I love the fact that we're getting to still revisit both the character of Anakin as well as Darth Vader. I think everything that has to do with Vader's castle is just awesome. And then again, just following it up now with the introduction of Darth Vader proper, even just starting with the shot of his silhouette against the wall, his silhouette looming over Director Krennic, and even Krennic here looks scared. Yes, they're on the same side technically, serving the Empire, but even Krennic can acknowledge like, oh boy, I'm out of my depth here. And I love that they do the classic music sting of Vader's theme. And now we're getting him. We're getting Darth Vader. Can you believe it? Darth Vader's here, one of the greatest characters in all of fiction. And what's interesting too is that as he approaches Krennic, we see here that Vader has red lenses for the mask, which is something that Star Wars kind of changes at liberty, I think, when it comes to representations of Vader. So for the sake of canon, it's interesting because Darth Vader has black lenses in A New Hope, yet here in Rogue One, at least for this portion, he has red lenses. I don't think he has red lenses the entire way through Rogue One. I think at some point they do transition his mask back to black lenses. I'm just being honest. I've always liked Vader with the red lenses. I know some people don't. They just like the straight uniformity of the all black appearance on the mask. I like the red lenses, and I like the fact that it's utilized here uh, on Mustafar as well. Again, just kind of, harkening back to the lava portion of Mustafar itself as the planet. So I like the red on the face. I mean, I like every design of Vader, whether it's red lenses, black lenses. I'm all in on this. But I know when the movie came out, this was an actual talking point. People were saying, how can he, have red? I don't like it. Well, I disagree. I like it, but again, and we'll discover this together as the movie goes on. But like, I'm pretty sure by the time we see the end of the movie and we catch up with Vader again, I don't think he has red lenses. I think that they've gone back to the traditional black that he has at the time of A New Hope, which would make sense for the continuity of A New Hope. But I'm also wondering, just in terms of the film, why would he take the time to modify this part of his mask. Again, is it a big deal? No, it's not. It's really more so for visual appeal than anything else. But yeah, I like the red and I like the black, but I like seeing it here. I think it looks cool, and yeah, it'll be interesting to see at what point the lenses do transition back to their all black, if I remember Rogue One correctly. But yeah, as I said, we will find out together here as the movie goes on. This whole exchange here between Vader and Krennic is great. Again, the dialogue is amazing, and also this scene, is just a great companion piece to the dialogue that Krennic has been sharing with Tarkin, to where Krennic is, essentially losing his cool to Tarkin and is trying to not get agitated by him. Yet Tarkin clearly does get under Krennic's skin, hence why Krennic is here in the first place, because Tarkin said the last time we saw them was, I will now be taking over this installation, and Krennic is like, we stand here amidst my achievements. I mean, he throws down the gauntlet and he says, we'll see about that. And then he runs to figure out if what Tarkin is talking about is legit. He goes to Edu to confront Galen, then all that stuff happens. Then he goes to Vader to essentially plead his case and to be like, what's going on here? I did what the Emperor requested. I gave him the greatest weapon he's ever seen and all this stuff. And I love here that Vader kind of humors Krennic throughout this exchange, by letting him speak. But Vader is also just an overwhelming presence, both literally and metaphorically. And he's reminding Krennic that, like, look, I'll give you some time to speak, but know that I've already made up my mind. The decision across the board has already been made about what's going on, and I'm humoring you. I'm letting you speak. I'm in charge. I'm top dog, second only to the Emperor. So here we go. And you can see Krennic is upset and all this stuff. And, Vader calls him out and he's like, you seem agitated, director. And Krennic says, oh, I just, don't have a lot of time. I got a lot of things to do. And Vader says, my apologies. You do have a great many things to explain. I mean, he is just giving Krennic the rope to hang himself with, and then Krennic just, he starts in on what he thinks he deserves. He says, I feel I deserve an audience, to show the remarkable potential of the Death Star. And Vader is, literally closing in on him. He's literally stepping towards him, getting closer and closer to his face as Krennic is speaking. And Krennic here is probably wishing he could eat his words with every breath. And then, he's talking about everything that's happened. Vader is saying, like, you did a test, you destroyed a city, there all this stuff's going on. And Krennic literally says, it was Governor Tarkin that suggested the test. He's literally shifting blame. He's like, Tarkin did it, not me. I'm innocent, all this stuff. And then Vader, puts him back in his place and says, you were not here. You were not summoned here to grovel. He's calling out Krennic for his behavior. And then Vader lays it out. He says, there is no Death Star. The Senate has been informed that Jeddah was destroyed in a mining disaster. Again, going back to the Senate, still appealing to this position of politics. But we know that between the end of Rogue One and A New Hope, the Senate's going to get fully wiped away. So the Senate is literally in its waning couple of days, if not hours. But still, for the purposes right now, the shroud of secrecy has to still be around the Death Star because they haven't fully revealed it yet to the galaxy. They did a test of small scale power on Jeddah. Well, we know in A New Hope they're going to do a full power firing test on Alderaan, and we know of course how that goes. But for right now, there still needs to be some secrecy around this because there can still be a lot of civil unrest caused by the presence of a Death Star. And then Darth Vader reminds him that, you know, he reminds Krennic, you have to be on top of this. I trust you will not rest until you ensure that Galen Erso has not compromised the Death Star in any way. So Vader is, of course, speaking on behalf of the Emperor. And as we know, Galen Erso did compromise the Death Star because, again, we have New Hope. Got to make that trench run, shoot that, torpedo, into the reactor and so on and so forth. But this last little bit here is after all this. So Vader says, I trust that you won't rest until you've assured with certainty that Galen Erso has not compromised the station. And Vader's leaving, and Galen Erso, and Director Krennic literally, he takes all that as he is still in charge because he literally turns around with a smile on his face and he's like, so I'm still in command then. If you're putting me in charge of, figuring out the issues with the Death Star, that means I'm still in command. And then he goes on to say, you'll speak to the Emperor about, and that's when Vader literally shuts him up with the Force, and we hear that classic choking sound of the Force coming into play. We get to hear Krennic's, windpipe get restricted. A great sound, very iconic sound, You'll know it when you hear it type thing in Star Wars. But yeah, the fact that Krennic, again, he stands face to face with the Dark Lord of the Sith, Darth Vader himself, and Vader puts him in his place. And and the thing that Krennic gets out of all of this is, oh, so I'm still in command? All is good? And, would you mind passing that along to the Emperor, please? Because all he wants is the accolades. All he wants is the respect. He wants his name on a pedestal. He wants statues built to him as, one of the premier directors of the Empire. He delivered the Death Star, hence why, he's having this issue with with Tarkin, excuse me, and why he's now here with Vader in the first place. And I love this part too. Vader force chokes Director Krennic, and then he says, be careful not to choke on your aspirations, Director. And I know people had some issue with that line when the movie came out, because they're like, why would Darth Vader make a pun? I think it's great. I think it's a great line in terms of a air quotes joke. I also think it's a great line in terms of Vader, just speaking in the double entendre. Like I think it's great. I love it. I love the fact that we get to see Vader force choke someone. I love the line. I think it's great. Even when Krennic seemingly has his feet back beneath him, the rug just gets pulled out from underneath him again. And yeah, again, everything that has to do with Vader's castle, Mustafar, we're only on the planet for like maybe 5, 6, 7 minutes. Everything about it I think is incredible, and this dialogue was no exception. This scene here, we find ourselves back on Yavin 4, and now the Rebel Alliance, the Council, is having a roundtable discussion about what to do next. And I have some opinions on this scene here because from one standpoint, I like its content. I like the fact that the rebels are talking about, there's infighting among them. What do we do now? If the Death Star is real, should we go attack it? And even if we wanted to, do we have the firepower? Do we have the capability to defeat such a weapon? But then other members of the council or other alliance will say, well, hold on. There's no way a Death Star could even be possible. So it must just be a trap to lure all of us in and to get us taken care of with one shot. I like that fact that they're having to to parse this out, to make a decision, for the sake of the alliance and whatnot. However, though I just said all that in the span of 90 seconds, the actual I don't know if this scene was really necessary in the final cut, because by the time we get to A New Hope, when the Death Star attack begins, I've always assumed that the Alliance had a great sense of uniformity among its ranks. I always got the sense that the Alliance, while still on the back foot compared to the Empire, kind of had their stuff together, and they all had this idea of, this is our objective. We are going to take on the Death Star. It's, a near impossible task, but we're going to do it anyway. Well, just a few, again, days or hours prior to this, we see the infighting, and so I just find it interesting that the Rebel Alliance had issues even with the concept of a Death Star. Then in the next movie, they're taking on the Death Star. I guess you could justify this by saying that by rallying and going to Scarif for the final act of the movie, that gave them some unity. That after they went, phew, we took care of Scarif and we got the plans. Now we got to continue on. Phase one is done. Get on to phase two. That does make sense. I always thought though that this was just a little unnecessary, but I get it. I get why they would do this. This increases the stakes not only for this individual movie being Rogue One, but it also does increase the stakes for A New Hope, in the grander context of the Star Wars universe. But again, I think it might be just an example of a little bit too much frosting on the cake. But again, as I just said, I presented both the positives and the negatives for this scene, so it works. It's just when it came down to editing the movie, I don't know if I would have left it in, but I get why they did. In the end. Despite me saying I have my quibbles with the previous scene, it does set up the exact next scene where, Jin leaves the meeting disappointed, saying that the rebellion would, prefer to surrender, to scatter than to stand and fight, and then she doesn't want to, obviously, but now their numbers are even smaller than before. Well, here comes Cassian with the cavalry. He himself and this band of other rebels have decided that this is a point where we are not just going to blindly follow the rebellion. Though we're all fighting for the same cause, we're not just gonna take orders and just say yes ma'am, yes sir. You have to fight for what you believe in. You have to fight for what you think is right. And Jin and Cassian now are on the same side. Ideologically speaking, they're in lockstep with each other. Because Cassian says, I believe you, about Scarif. I believe you about the Death Star. I believe you about all this stuff. And he says, we'd like to volunteer, all of us, because now he's talking about how they've all had to do terrible things on behalf of the rebellion, things that they might regret, even being spies, being assassins, so on and so forth. But now they have a sense of agency amongst themselves to pursue their own course of action. Not to necessarily convey the rebellion as being the bad guys, but again, there's this gray area that Cassian has existed in, as well as the rebellion itself. Within the greater concept of the alliance. And as I mentioned before, it's about character development and all that stuff, which is fine and good. But I liked the fact that Cassian was kind of this no nonsense rebel who will literally do what is necessary to get the job done. And in a sense, he is still holding on to those character traits here because he's doing what he feels is necessary to get the job done, which is to go against the council, which is to follow Jin with, instead of having, 1,000 fighters, they're going to have 10, and they're going to just, continue on with the good fight. So, yeah, the context for all this stuff is everything. Like the previous scene where the council is sitting around the round table, I don't know. But again, it leads into this scene, which then leads into the next thing. And so it does all work. It does all work. Sometimes, though, it's just a bit of an interesting thing to digest, being a Star Wars fan that knows the beginning, the middle, and the end of the saga. Again, we know what comes after Rogue One, that being Into a New Hope. But yeah, it just makes for an interesting dissection of the movie. And then this bit here, how can you not smile over it? I love the classic cliche cheeseball idea of saying the title of the movie in the movie, and now we get that from Bodhi Rook here as he's preparing to pilot on the stolen Imperial shuttle. And of course, the dispatch at Rebel HQ is like, what are you doing on that tarmac? You're not clear for liftoff. And Bodhi's like, yes, we are. And then flight controller's like, "What's your call sign, pilot?" And Bodhi's like, "We're Rogue. We're Rogue One. That's it. We're Rogue One." And then the flight controller's like, "Rogue One? There is no Rogue One." And it's like, up, he said it. He said the thing. So I like the moment. It just brings a smile to my face. And speaking of moments that bring a smile to my face, I mean, holy guacamole, this little exchange here with Mon Mothma and Bail Organa. I mean, like, wow, so much is conveyed in just a few seconds and a few sentences. Because you have Bail Organa talking about how in light of this now, he has to get back to Alderaan. So we know, unfortunately, he is on Alderaan when it is destroyed in A New Hope. And then Mon Mothma says, you know the Jedi, can you reach out, to him, the Jedi in hiding? We're going to need all of our allies, every advantage we can possibly get. So she's referring to Obi-Wan Kenobi, which is fantastic. And then they name drop as well, the Clone Wars. Bail Organa says, he served me well in the Clone Wars. He's lived in hiding since the Emperor's Purge. I mean, like, oh my gosh, it's such juicy dialogue. And then, Mon Mothma adds on by saying, you'll need to send someone you can trust to retrieve him. And she's referring, to who we find out is Princess Leia, and Bail Organa says, I would trust her with my life. And so just right there, just in that little bit of dialogue, we have mentions and allusions to of Obi-Wan Kenobi, of Princess Leia, of the Clone Wars. It's all fantastic. This is another great character moment too, because as the shuttle is now approaching Scarif, they have the planet-wide shield, one point of entry type stuff. And Bodhi talks about how this shuttle should have a clearance code, an access code, since it's an Imperial ship, to get us through the shield. And K2SO says, well, unless they've already listed this ship as stolen, and they wipe the codes and whatnot. And we see, it's this do or die moment of transmitting the codes, and will the Empire retrieve them? Will they let them through? And then they do this nice shot here of Jyn Erso taking out her kyber crystal necklace, and she holds it in her hands and she closes her eyes. And I've always kind of thought that this was her in that moment, kind of saying a prayer to the Force, kind of just saying, please let this work, please let us get through. I really like that character beat. And also from a few scenes earlier, when they were actually boarding the shuttle, she addressed everyone inside, and she said, may the Force be with us. So we get a sense here that Jyn, again, is appealing to the stronger and higher nature of the Force, and that she's trying to put her faith in something other than just people around her. And I think that is a really, really cool moment. And as I've said before, Rogue One is just really well written, really good dialogue. I really, really like some of the stuff here. The one quote that Cassian said earlier in this scene, as the rebels are landing onto Scarif, he breaks down the plan and all that stuff, and he tells his soldiers to draw the fire of the stormtroopers, to be a distraction. And he says, make 10 men feel like 100. Love that quote. Love that quote. I have literally used that outside of the context of Star Wars before. I don't get to use it all the time, but I think that's a real unique piece of dialogue that has stuck in my head over the years. And then, of course, we get a classic Star Wars line delivery via K2SO where he says, "I've got a bad feeling about this." Just stuff like that, just little things like that. I've really appreciated from Rogue One, and yeah, as I've said before, and I will probably say again a few more times before the movie finishes, this movie is so well written, it is freaking crazy. Another great line delivery here via Director Krennic. As the attack begins on Scarif, he turns to address the control room, which is standing by quite idly, and he's like, "Are we blind? Deploy the garrison!" I love that. I think that's a great line. And then this shot here, as the Empire is responding to the situation, we get our first shot of an Imperial shore trooper. So it appears that the Empire has a type of soldier for every kind of situation. They've got the standard stormtrooper, then they got the pilots and the scouts, and so on and so forth. Well, if there's ever a situation where the Empire needs to take control of a beach, yeah, they could send in just some standard stormtroopers, but they also got to send in the specific shore troopers, and their armor looks quite cool, and it's colored to look more like a sandy kind of environment. I will say though, it is a very specific designation for a trooper, but I mean, Scarif is of incredibly high importance, so I guess you want to have some personnel that are more readily equipped for this type of environment and the terrain. But yeah, a really cool design, but also really specific as well. But hey, it continues to expand the Star Wars universe. So really, I'm just kind of complaining about a good thing ultimately. And as the Alliance gets word of what is happening on Scarif, and they are mobilizing reinforcements to go help out the rebels that are already there, we get to see even more legacy characters, that being C-3PO and R2-D2. And come on, how can this not make you smile? It's really nice to see them. I think this is great. Really, just makes me happy to see two of my favorite characters in all of fiction, back on the big screen. And then just a little earlier in this scene here, where the information is being conveyed to Mon Mothma, there's a blink and you miss it cameo for the droid Chopper, which is from the series Rebels, the animated series Rebels. And so, previously I mentioned how you got to see part of a ship from that series. Well, now you get to technically see a character from the Rebels TV show in Chopper. He's a blink and you miss it cameo. So again, continuing to blur the lines of animation and live action into one cohesive story. But yeah, for me, the real standout of the droid cameos in Rogue One, seeing Chopper's cool, but seeing R2 and C-3PO, I mean, they are the classic dynamic duo here. And so yeah, I love seeing them, and I think it's really fun. This whole final act here of Rogue One, essentially the last third of the movie, is just spectacular. I mean, the action is incredible, and you've got the way Star Wars can divide its action into segments that you're constantly jumping from is awesome. You've got the smaller team of Cassian and Jin, infiltrating the vault to get the Death Star plans. You have the rebels outside handling the ground troops, and then you have this epic space battle as well. And yeah, it's awesome. It's awesome getting lost in all the action. We ourselves as viewers don't lose any of our perception of it, but like we're in it. We're just gonna just watch the battles play out. It's freaking sweet. And then of course getting to see something like an AT-AT return, the AT-AT, I think is sweet. Love this shot here of it coming out of the smoke, and then we go up into space, and we get to see even more digital recreations of characters, because characters like Red Leader and I believe Gold Leader as well. Those actors, they sadly passed away since their inclusion in 1977's A New Hope. But yeah, they were also included as well using archival footage and probably some deep fake and some AI and all that stuff. So yes, like Tarkin is kind of the cream of the crop when it comes to recreating someone in a digital landscape. But they did it for a few pilots here too, and I really enjoy their inclusion as well. I think it just makes everything feel that much more deeper. And yeah, just all the combat here getting underway now. Again, in the air, on the ground, in the structure itself, I think it's just freaking sweet. Here's another shot of one of those GoPro mounted angle, cameras, once again affixed to an X-wing. And again, the combat of Rogue One, especially in this last third here, is just incredible. And this space sequence is no exception. And I love the fact that the X-wing pilot is like, we're going in, and they dive in on this structure, and they're dodging turbo lasers and TIE fighters and all that stuff. And I gotta be honest, and I mean this so sincerely, watching this stuff, I got a little glassy eyed. There's just something about the classic appeal, the fun nature to all this stuff. That watching this stuff here makes me feel like a kid. Just again, the combination of all the different action sequences of seeing X-wings fighting in space, and also some that made it through to the surface of Scarif, and so now they're dive bombing, the AT-ATs and all that stuff, and like just seeing all this stuff just reminds me of like playing with action figures and letting your imagination run wild in the world of Star Wars. And I think Rogue One really does this to perfection. It really just achieves that imagination aspect to it all, and I love it. I love every second of this stuff. I like this shot here of Imperial reinforcements, being scrambled. I like this shot of all the TIE fighters just flooding out of the hangar bays. I mean, they are just swarming like flies. I really enjoy this visual, and I think it's pretty sweet. And speaking of the space battle here, we see as more Tie fighters come in that they are overwhelming the X-wings. One of them being Red Squadron. Red Five gets cut off from the rest of the squadron. It's like a four versus one type of situation, and Red Five gets eliminated. Funny enough, Red Five was Luke's call sign in A New Hope. So when he is in his X-wing and he is scrambled to go fight the Death Star, his call sign is Red Five, and so he took on the call sign, and so yeah, unfortunately, the original Red Five died over the Battle of Scarif, but Luke took his seat, and then Star Wars is a history from there. And then here is another blink and you'll miss it addition to Rogue One. What's interesting is that over the ground battle of Scarif, as X-Wings are making their strafing runs on the AT-ATs and all that stuff, we see another version of a TIE fighter as well. And I believe that this is referred to as the TIE Striker. And I think that this is meant to be an in-atmosphere only version of a TIE fighter. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's what that's meant to be. Hence why we don't see any of them over the Battle of Scarif up in space. I think they're meant to just operate, within a planet and whatnot. So yeah, it's a pretty cool design, and I like the fact that we're getting to see again new things added to the Star Wars universe. So yeah, the arsenal of Tie fighters continues to expand. We got the Tie fighter, proper. We got the bomber. We got the interceptor, and now we have the Tie striker, and I think it's a pretty cool design. The death of K2SO, I remember in the theater that hit like a freaking truck. And that was something too that fans were wondering in regards to Rogue One, because we have all these new characters. We have Jyn Erso, Cassian Andor, K2SO, but we never hear about them through the original trilogy. We never hear about them, in A New Hope or anything like that. And so there was this idea that, like, what's going to happen to them? What happened to them after the events of Rogue One? And then there was this idea too of like, well, are they going to die? Are they not going to make it? And I know a lot of fans, myself included, was like, no, no, no. Are you kidding? Disney Star Wars? They're not going to kill them all. They're going to maybe kill some or maybe kill one, and the rest will escape. And then they'll just say that, oh, they were off doing, whatever with the whatever during the time of, this and that. But when K2SO died, it was an emotional, punch. and little did we know it was indicative of many things to come. It was the first domino to fall, so yeah, it's a really interesting creative decision that they made to just take out our heroes literally one at a time. And yeah, K2SO, when he went down, I remember feeling that, and I still feel that to this day during this rewatch. All of this stuff right here, just freaking catnip. Again, kids, the ending of Rogue One, the entire last third, just incredible. Getting to see a much better shot of the TIE strikers, and getting to see, a freaking U-wing get shot down, and soldiers running on the beach, and soldiers just ragdolling from explosions, getting caught in blaster fire, and then you have the deployment of the the Death Trooper reinforcements. All this stuff here is just incredible, incredible stuff. The combat, the sense of scale to this, you really do feel like you're in a war. Like, I mean, it's just the battle is fierce. It's everywhere. It's in your face. It is so freaking awesome. It is so much fun to get lost in all this Star Wars combat. This shot here of Chirrut walking across the battlefield in a straight line, just repeating his prayer. I'm one with the Force. The Force is with me. I'm one with the Force. The Force is with me. As he's walking across, no man's land essentially, and blaster fire is just missing him. I think it's a really cool, really powerful moment. And it's a shame that all these characters, had to die. But man, I would have loved if Chirrut and Baze could have lived. I would have really liked to have seen what these characters could have done beyond the Battle of Scarif, beyond maybe even the original trilogy. Who knows? But yeah, for Chirrut to have yet another really cool moment like this, I think it's just awesome. Again, it's a great performance from a great actor, bringing to life a great character, and I love the character of Chirrut. I love this moment, and it just makes his death all that more impactful. And yeah, just as I mentioned, with Chirrut's death, making it all that more impactful. Baze's reaction to this, rushing out into the battlefield to go retrieve his friend, that in of itself is strong enough. But then to have Baze, who, you know, as described earlier in the movie, has had kind of a crisis of faith, from being a guardian of the wills, in this moment, holding his dying friend in his arms, he repeats the mantra, I'm one with the Force is with me, So in this moment, his own faith, his own reliance on the Force is coming back, or it's certainly swelling again. And yeah, it's yeah, I really like this moment. And again, very similar to Chirrut here. That Baze, great actor, great performance, great character, and now Baze, unfortunately, when he dies as well, his own death is now just all that more elevated now. And yeah, it's a real shame to see him go too. But he goes out in a really cool and emotional way. Because we get to see him take out a few troopers as well before he meets his end. But this moment here of him reconnecting with Chirrut and reconnecting with the Force in a way, I think is just really, really awesome. And now it's Bodhi Rook's turn, unfortunately, to get lost in the battle. And like I said earlier, it makes sense for these characters to unfortunately meet their end, because we don't hear about them throughout the original trilogy, or even in A New Hope for that matter. But yeah, just to see them all get cut down one at a time, I remember in the theater just being like, oh my gosh, they're gonna do it. None of them are gonna make it out. K2SO, I thought, okay, maybe they'll start and stop there. But then when Chirrut died, then when Bodhi died, I was like, oh boy, here we go. And then, like I said, it's followed up with Baze making his last stand. But yeah, it's just yeah, seeing them all get taken down is sad, and and unfortunate, but it's cool and entertaining in another way too, because again they're all just fighting this great Goliath that is the Empire, that is the Death Star. And because of their sacrifice, we go on to get to have a New Hope and the rest of the saga. But so yeah, they all gave their lives to really cool causes, and they also all had really cool and unique deaths as well. And yeah, it was just it's a shame to see them go, but they were great characters, and I'm glad that we got to have them for as long as we did. This shot here of the Hammerhead Corvette as it prepares to impact the Star Destroyer. I believe the Hammerhead design is from the Old Republic series of Star Wars games, though I'm not real confident in that opinion because I was never real big into the Old Republic. I just know it existed. I never really played it that much, but I think that's where that design came from. And so again, it's cool to get to see old Star Wars designs get repurposed into other things as well. And yeah, whether or not it did exist in previous Star Wars media, it makes its cool reintroduction or perhaps introduction here. And yeah, it leads to a really cool scene later. Now, this shot here of Jyn Erso is really interesting from a production standpoint of this movie. Because if you remember earlier in this recording, in this analysis of the movie, I talked about how Rogue One was apparently reshot, air quotes, heavily, whether that was 20%, 30%, 50%, who knows. But if you go and watch the trailers for this movie when this thing was still coming out, you can see a lot of shots in the trailers that are not present in the movie. One of them being a similar shot here of Jyn Erso as she's walking on this catwalk. She has now reached the top of the Citadel, and she has to get over to the control panel to realign the antenna to blast out the Death Star plans to the Alliance that's up above the planet. So in the trailer, she does the similar motion, walks towards the control relay, takes out her blaster, and as she does that, the shot then cuts to a shot of a TIE fighter rising up in front of the platform to do something. We're not really sure what. The TIE fighter doesn't swoop in like it's, I see something and makes a banking left. In the trailer, it literally rises up into frame. It just lifts itself up into frame. And so I was led to believe that Jyn Erso had wind of this, that she knew this was probably coming, hence why she took out her blaster, because I think in the original cut of the movie, she was maybe going to shoot the TIE fighter, shoot the pilot through the cockpit, and send it spiraling down. I don't know. I also find it interesting, too, that the way the TIE fighter, again, comes into frame, that being it literally just lifts up, onto the level of her. I wonder if maybe that was a way Cassian was going to try to get them down to the surface. I'm just saying it appears that the TIE fighter is being flown in an unusual flight pattern, which leads me to believe that maybe someone else was inside the TIE fighter. But then again, why would Jyn Erso unholster her weapon, if she knew Cassian Andor had commandeered a TIE fighter? Or maybe she didn't know, and she just heard this TIE fighter rumbling and was ready to just start blasting it. I'm not entirely sure. I do think, though, that it would have been a cool moment for her to just take out the TIE fighter herself with her blaster, again, just blast it through the cockpit, if it was commandeered by an Imperial. But I digress. That's something that you can see in one of the trailers. Well, in the final cut of the movie, the one that you can watch on Disney Plus, on your Blu-ray, DVD, whatever you have, she does the same action. She unholsters her blaster, takes it out, holds it at her side, and walks to the control relay for the antenna. But there's nothing there. There's no TIE fighter. There's nothing. So she essentially unholsters her blaster for nothing. She walks 20 feet with one blaster in hand, and and then just activates the antenna realignment controls. So what was this for? Why was this scene kept? Well, I think that this is another example of kind of some stitching going on between the two alternate cuts of the movie. And I think that, it was easier to say remove the TIE fighter than it was to reshoot everything, but, again, I don't mean to armchair quarterback this, but maybe if you're going to keep the shot of her unholstering her blaster, maybe include an Imperial officer is, on that catwalk and she just has to blast him quickly and then get to the control panel. Something like that. Who knows? I'm not sure. But for the sake of it just being in the movie now, she takes out her blaster for nothing. Now, you could justify this by saying, well, there's a raging battle going on all around her. She's got stormtroopers behind her in the facility. She's got this ground battle going on with multiple X-wings and TIE fighters. Oh, and then she's got the space battle going on above her outside of atmosphere as well. So it makes sense for her to be at the ready, so to speak, to maybe shoot at a TIE fighter that gets too close, or shoot at a stormtrooper in a jetpack, whatever. So it makes sense for her to be at the ready, but in the movie, there is no purpose for her taking out her blaster. But in the trailer for the movie, it presents that there is a problem being a TIE fighter, hence why she takes out the blaster. But again, in the final cut of the movie, there is no TIE fighter, there is no immediate threat, there's just nothing there. Yet the scene of her, the action of her walking towards the control panel with the blaster in hand remains. So it's just, again, I'm not knocking the movie for it. I'm not saying it's bad, anything like that. I'm just saying it's interesting because there are a few moments, and there probably are a few more moments I missed, that point towards there being the quote-unquote original cut of this movie, and that there could be some stitching going on between cut 1, cut 2, so on and so forth. So yeah, just an interesting thing to think about. And this sequence here, this is what I was talking about with the payoff of the Hammerhead cruiser coming in. Seeing two Star Destroyers collide with each other in spectacular fashion to create this huge explosion. When this happened in the theater back in 2016, I literally said wow out loud. And even now, it still gives me that wow factor of like, what a cool thing to see. Who would have thought that this is how they would choose to, to bring down the shield generator over Scarif? Like, what a unique way to do this. What a unique way to have it orchestrated. And just what a unique sequence to see here, again, of these two Star Destroyers colliding together. I just, again, it appeals back to the imagination factor of playing with your action figures and all that great stuff. So yeah, I love this portion of the space battle. What a cool shot of the Death Star rising up over the horizon of Scarif. Just a really, really cool visual right there. This is another example of where an alternate take might have been utilized in a different cut in the movie, perhaps, because we see here that the Death Star has now fired onto the Scarif base, very similar to Jedha, single reactor ignition, stuff like that. What's interesting though is that this is how director Krennic meets his demise in the movie. He quite literally gets killed by the tool, that he created. He made the weapon that ended up killing him, which is, poetic and all that stuff. And he literally takes a Death Star blast to the face. I mean, it's not like the shockwave kills him or anything like that. No, the literal laser beam hits the platform that he's on. So, I mean, he is as vaporized as you can get. But what's interesting is that I heard, and this is not in the trailers or anything like that, I heard that the original way Krennic was going to die was actually at the hands of Darth Vader. That was going to be the way he went out, and that Darth Vader was actually going to decapitate him with his lightsaber. I don't know if that's accurate or not. Again, that's not in the trailer. I have not seen any footage of that. I've just heard over the years that as this movie was reshot and recut and all that stuff, that some stuff was left on the cutting room floor, one of them being the quote-unquote original death of director Krennic, and that was going to be at the hands of Darth Vader. Instead, though, we get his demise at the hands of the Death Star, again taking a direct shot right to the face. But I I like this death. I think it's cool. I think it serves the story well, and it sets up the unfortunate end of our last couple of our heroes here. But yeah, I think it's a cool sequence overall. And then this right here, what a cool introduction for Darth Vader to be reintroduced back into the movie. He arrives on Scarif to, you think, the day is won, the battle is over, the rebels are gonna escape. But Darth Vader shows up and literally rams rebel ships with his Star Destroyer. And then as he's overseeing the battle, we see here that he still has red lenses. His eyes are still red, which I find interesting. But again, I like the red lenses, but yeah, this is just a cool shot, and it's nice to see Vader come back into the movie because we know what's coming at the end here, and oh boy, I cannot wait to get to that. But before we get to the Vader of it all at the end of the movie, we have to unfortunately see the end of our heroes here. We get to see the demise of Cassian Andor and Jyn Erso. And yeah, as I said earlier, I never thought that Rogue One would eliminate all of the characters from the crew. I think maybe from a fun factor, I might have wanted the movie to do that, but I never thought that actually would happen because like it just didn't seem like it was in Disney's MO to do that. But they're tying up loose ends as well, so that way it doesn't conflict with the original trilogy, which I respect, and all that. But yeah, just again watching our heroes get cut down one by one, and then getting to see, Cassian and Jyn, the last two, get vaporized by the Death Star. What was a pretty emotional beat then, and it's still emotional now. And this sequence right here, this was the promise of Rogue One, that in this movie we were going to get to see some incredible Vader footage. And yes, we got to see him on Mustafar, which was great. He had great dialogue, but we wanted to see Vader just unleashed. We wanted to see him use the Force, use the lightsaber, all that stuff, and to get to see him march down this hallway and eliminate the rebels in a last ditch effort to retrieve the plans to the Death Star. This was everything. This was worth the ticket price alone. The rest of the movie is great. It is. But this is the cherry on top. This is the cherry on top. And I remember being in the theater, and getting the sense that he was coming, and then hearing his breathing in the darkness, and then seeing that red lightsaber ignite. Like, oh baby, that was a special, special time, and yeah, just what an awesome moment. So rewatchable amongst this whole movie, and I love this. This gave us the Vader that we wanted. I love it. I could watch it over and over again, and yeah, it's really really cool. And look here, just to put a button on it, this last shot of Vader as he watches the blockade runner leave the cruiser. Black lenses, black lenses. And you might be thinking, well, Jim, maybe it was just red because his mask was reflecting the lava of Mustafar. But I disagree because we saw in the previous shot of Vader when he's still aboard his Star Destroyer. As he comes into battle, he says, "Prepare a boarding party." If you watch that sequence where he's giving out those orders, his lenses look red. They look like they're red. So if they are reflecting something, there must be quite a bright light on that Star Destroyer. But I'm of the mindset that the lenses were red up until this last little bit here. I'm not saying it's necessarily a continuity error, but maybe again that's another instance of some stitching going on between a couple of different cuts of the movie here. I will say though that the black lenses does line up with how we see Vader in A New Hope, especially in those close-up shots. They are clearly, black on black, but again, prior to the lightsaber sequence, when Vader is told, The cruiser is disabled. He says, prepare a boarding party. Watch that scene again. His lenses are red. And then I believe as he's going through the hallway as well, they're also red. Again, you could make the example of they are reflecting the redness from the blaring alarm system and the lightsaber. Okay, fine, perhaps, sure, but again, that sequence inside the Death Star, they appear very red, and now here in this last shot, they're black. So again, just an interesting thing, not a bad thing, not a bad thing. It's just interesting, and I like pointing it out. But yeah, anyway, let's move on to the last scene here. And this moment, this shot right here, seeing the back of Princess Leia, there were many gasps in the theater. This brought a tear to my eye. Then it even got me a little misty eyed now. Seeing Princess Leia, again, much like Tarkin, much like Mustafar, I did not think we were going to get to see this. I did not expect Rogue One to have any kind of Princess Leia in it, let alone to be the final shot of the movie, and then to see her turn around and to see a digitally de-aged Princess Leia, to see, Carrie Fisher recreated from her look in 77 and to have her say the line, hope. Just magnificent, magnificent. If the Vader sequence was the cherry on top, then the Leia sequence was the cherry on top of the cherry. I just think it's incredible, and I was so happy to have gotten to see more of Princess Leia in that classic design, the white robes with with the hair buns. I just think it's awesome. But anyway, kids, that brings us to the end of Rogue One. Oh my gosh, can you believe it, kids? I love this movie, and getting to revisit it in such an in-depth way, to go almost shot by shot. I have a new appreciation for it, and the fact that this is 10 years old blows my mind because again, I can remember seeing it in the theater. I can vividly remember seeing it in the theater, and it hit me really hard then. It hits me really hard now, and I think this movie has aged beautifully. And I had not realized how much of a absolute buffet this movie is for Star Wars fans. You get Clone Wars nods, you get prequel nods, you get original trilogy stuff, Bail Organa, Mon Mothma, Darth Vader, you get Tarkin, you get this. This movie is a love letter to the Star Wars saga, and I think it's just incredible. I think it's one of the best Star Wars movies out there, and I also just think at the end of the day, it's a great movie. I think it has a lot to offer, and so yeah, I hope you have enjoyed revisiting it as much as I have for its 10th anniversary. And though we did go shot by shot together, after you get done listening to this and all that stuff and watching, and again, thank you for watching and for listening. I hope that you yourself will go back and rewatch the movie as well, that you'll see it in its complete form, in full context, with all the sounds, with all the music. I think you will really enjoy it. And yeah, it literally it was better than I remembered, and I already had it set, with a high bar. But again, getting to see it again was awesome. And so yeah, kids, that'll do it for this episode of the Far Out Podcast. Thank you so much for watching, for listening, and may the force be with you. All right, bye bye.